36th special session and should not serve as a precedent. Now let me ask if there are any delegations wishing to take the floor at this time on the proposed extraordinary modalities. I see none. Can I take it that the Council agrees to the proposed modalities and those modalities will be applied during the 36th special session under the current circumstances? And since I see no objections, it is so decided. Excellencies, colleagues, please be reminded that you should respect the speaking time limits and speak at a reasonable pace in order to allow for good interpretation of your statements. I would also like to take this opportunity to ask everyone's support to ensure that the special session is carried out in an efficient and dignified manner. I kindly ask all delegates to adhere to language that is commensurate with dignity. I now have the honor to give the floor to Mr. Voker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to make a statement via video message.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. 4 years ago, the people of Sudan lit a beacon of hope for millions around the world. On 11 April 2019, popular protests brought an end to decades of tyranny and human rights violations, toppling the long-standing dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. Women and young people were at the forefront, demanding good governance and a new social contract between the state and the people, based on democracy, freedom, justice, and a fair share of development. This inspiring movement was followed by significant reforms, but the hoped-for transition to full civilian rule and democracy was once again dashed in October 21, when General al-Burhan and General Dagalo jointly carried out a military coup. Last month, fighting exploded between the forces led by those same two men, plunging this much-suffering country into catastrophe. Since 15 April, at least 487 civilians have been killed, notably in Khartoum, Al-Janina, Niala, and El Obeid. The real figure is much higher. More than 154,000 people have fled the country, and an estimated 700,000 more have been displaced inside the borders of Sudan. Those who remain in areas affected by the conflict are at continued severe risk. In Khartoum, clashes between the two armed forces, shelling and airstrikes have taken place in heavily populated residential areas, and millions of people are now struggling to access food, fuel, and currency. In parts of Darfur, as well as the Blue Nile and Kordofan regions, the violence between military groups has triggered interethnic clashes. In West Darfur, at least 100 people have been killed and thousands displaced by intercommunal violence between so-called Arab and Masalit groups, allied respectively with the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. The country's health system has been severely damaged, with at least 17 attacks against health facilities and several others occupied by military forces. People who have been wounded, women in childbirth, or simply the severely ill have nowhere to go. Years of development efforts are being obliterated by damage to water, electricity, and communications infrastructure. Extensive and increasing looting of UN and international NGO offices, businesses, and private property have also obstructed the humanitarian operations that kept millions of people alive and in health. WFP projects that if the conflict continues, 2.5 million more people could become acutely food insecure within 3 to 6 months, bringing the total to 19 million people, more than half the population. Already some 50,000 acutely malnourished children have been cut off from receiving life-saving treatment, according to OCHA. I strongly condemn this wanton violence in which both sides have trampled international humanitarian law, notably the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. The Sudanese military has launched attacks in densely occupied civilian areas, including airstrikes. Last week, one airstrike reportedly hit the vicinity of a hospital in the East Nile area of Khartoum, killing several civilians. The RSF, meanwhile, has allegedly taken over numerous buildings in Khartoum to use as operational bases, evicting residents and launching attacks from densely inhabited urban areas. These tactics place civilians at acute risk and prevent people from accessing critical supplies and assistance. We have also received several reports alleging sexual violence by uniformed men, as well as allegations of unlawful killings and enforced disappearances. Mr. President, 6 months ago, I visited Sudan. It was my first mission as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. At that pivotal moment in the country's history, with talks underway to shape a transition to fully democratic civilian government, I expressed my solidarity with the people of Sudan, and I needed to bring a strong message. Accountability and human rights must be at the core of any future agreement. In the course of that visit, I met both General Al-Burhan and General Dagalo, among many others. I urged them and all those who were involved in the talks to focus on accountability for past human rights violations and on the common good. Today, immense damage has been done, destroying the hopes and rights of millions of people. It is essential that both parties urgently commit to an inclusive political process and to a negotiated peace. The ongoing talks in Jeddah, which focus on creating a ceasefire, need to be complemented by commitments to establish a humanitarian truce, to enable life-saving deliveries of aid, to allow for safe passage for civilians from areas of hostilities, and to protect humanitarian supplies from looting. It is also crucial that discussions expand to respecting international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, and bringing an end to human rights violations. To date, despite intense diplomatic efforts, notably by the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the League of Arab States, and the United Nations, the leaders of the SAF and RSF have not agreed to discuss ending their hostilities. We have been moved by the courage and resilience of the people of Sudan, their desire for change and their attachment to principles of justice and freedom. They and their country are pivotal to the future of Africa. At the point where the two Niles, blue and white, surge into one majestic river, it is impossible not to see how profoundly connected is the continent and how powerfully its resources could drive growth and peace for millions of people. I condemn the use of violence by individuals who have no regard for the lives and fundamental rights of millions of their own compatriots. All parties must protect the rights of civilians and comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. If there's one lesson to be drawn from this tragic crisis, it is the pressing need for all transitional arrangements to build on bedrock commitments to accountability, non-discrimination, and participation, so that peace can be sustainable and stable because it is just. Mr. President, the Human Rights Council has called this special session to express its urgent concern for the rights and lives of Sudan's people. I take this opportunity to urge all states with influence in the region to encourage by all possible means the resolution of this crisis. In closing, I pay tribute to my staff, notably our national staff who have been directly affected by the fighting and severe shortages. I express my deepest and most heartfelt solidarity with the people of Sudan. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. Now let me give the floor to Ms. Thaneng Mofokeng, Chair of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures, and she's going to join us via Zoom. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I have the honor of addressing the Council today on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. We welcome the decision to convene a special session on the human rights impact on the ongoing conflict in Sudan. As shown by the joint statement issued this morning by several mandate holders, including myself, special procedures have followed the evolving situation in the country closely and expressed serious concerns about the plight of the Sudanese people. The situation of human rights in Sudan has actually been under the radar of special procedures for many years, especially of successive country mandate holders from 1993 to 2020. The crisis in the Sudan, sparked by the clashes between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, has now extended beyond 3 weeks. Throughout this period, innocent women, men, girls, and boys have borne the severe consequences of the conflict, enduring immense hardship and remaining exposed to significant protection risks. And the situation remains deeply distressing and demands urgent attention and action. Since the onset of hostilities, an alarming number of lives have been lost, with hundreds perishing and thousands sustaining injuries, tragically including children. The dire consequences of this crisis have compelled hundreds of thousands of individuals to seek refuge, while others have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Regrettably, Sudanese civilians in search of safety reportedly have found themselves subjected to egregious human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence, and deprived of vital necessities such as food, water, healthcare, including reproductive health, fuel, and other basic commodities. Moreover, the breakdown in communication services has added to the distressing predicament faced by those affected. Amidst this turmoil, numerous individuals find themselves trapped within densely populated residential areas of Khartoum, Bahri, Omdurman, as well as towns in Darfur and northern Kordofan. With the absence of electricity and the scarcity of healthcare and essential services, and the depletion of food, water, and medical supplies, they cannot confront an uncertain future as a direct consequence of the ongoing conflict. Of particular concern is also the safety and well-being of women and children, people with disabilities, and older persons. As families escape from hostilities, they face the distressing reality of being torn apart, which raises the likelihood of exposing them to severe human rights violations, such as enforced disappearances. Moreover, the ability to monitor and document the situation on the ground has been significantly hindered due to the targeting of journalists, as well as the intimidation and threats faced by human rights defenders, particularly women human rights defenders in Darfur and Khartoum. This situation has resulted in an information blackout. Mr. President, prior to this crisis, the Sudan already had 3.7 million internally displaced persons within that country. Tragically, the delivery of critically needed food assistance, vital infrastructure, and life-saving services has been subjected to what appear to be deliberate and indiscriminate attacks, posing a grave threat to the humanitarian personnel, including local healthcare workers, impeding their efforts. Despite the dedicated work of humanitarian organizations to expand the operations, the persistent conflict severely hampers access to essential provisions, including food and other necessities. Urgent and decisive measures are imperative to tackle the worsening crisis. We need to protect the rights and well-being of vulnerable people and rehabilitate critical infrastructure and services. These actions are crucial in guaranteeing unhindered access to healthcare and ensuring the safety and security of all individuals affected by the crisis. Mr. President, as stressed in the statement issued by Special Procedures yesterday on the present situation, we urgently implore the conflicting parties to cease all hostilities without delay, thereby de-escalating the volatile circumstances and creating an environment conducive to the resumption of unhindered and comprehensive humanitarian operations. This crucial step is paramount in alleviating the immense suffering endured by affected individuals, ensuring provision of life-saving protection to those in dire need and a pathway to sustainable development. We urge the conflicting parties to uphold their responsibilities according to international law, ensuring the safety of civilians and vital civilian infrastructure, such as schools and hospitals. It is crucial for them to publicly commit to safeguarding humanitarian personnel, facilities, and resources, thereby ensuring unrestricted access to aid and assistance. We recognize the efforts of neighboring countries and urge all states to maintain open borders, allowing the entry of individuals seeking refuge not to return any Sudanese presently abroad and to provide adequate protection and humanitarian aid to those who are fleeing in Sudan, including those who are already internally displaced within Sudan before the escalation. Additionally, we call all upon states to allocate resources to the neighboring countries, assisting them in accommodating the influx of people who are resulting from the Sudanese conflict. Finally, we urge the immediate initiation of independent and impartial investigations into the loss of civilian lives, injuries sustained by individuals, and cases of ill treatment and other gross human rights violations inflicted upon humanitarian personnel, healthcare workers, human rights defenders, journalists, as well as attacks on civilian infrastructure. Special procedures are ready to work with this council, the High Commissioner, and its designated expert to continue monitoring and providing advice to address and improve the situation on the ground. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam, for your statement. Colleagues, let me indicate that the list of speakers is now closed and we will now hear from the country concerned. So let me give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan. Ambassador, you have 5 minutes and you have the floor. Microphone, please.
شكرا جزيلا السيد الرئيس. أرجو في مستهل البيان أن أترحم على أرواح كل الذين سقطوا ضحايا المواجهات العسكرية في بلادي منذ تمرد قوات الدعم السريع في 15 من شهر أبريل المنصرم، مع الدعوات للمصابين بالشفاء العاجل. سيد الرئيس، أبدأ أولا بتوصيف ما يجري في السودان. لقد برز موضوع دعم قوات الدعم السريع في الجيش الوطني وهو قوات المسلحة السودانية كأحد أكبر تحديات الفترة الانتقالية، خاصة بعد توقيع اتفاق جبل السلام في 3 أكتوبر 2020 وانخراط حركات الكفاح المسلح في عمليات الإدماج وفقا لبروتوكول الترتيبات الأمنية ومبدأ الجيش الوطني الواحد كما هو الحال في كل بلدان العالم. لكن للأسف ظل موضوع الإدماج بندا مرحلا إلى أن تجلت الحقيقة في تمرد صارخ في صبيحة 15 من أبريل المنصرم، عندما استيقظت الخرطوم على وقع هجوم عسكري شامل من القوات المتمردة استهدف كل المرافق الاستراتيجية في الخرطوم، القيادة العامة للجيش، بيت الضيافة، مقر إقامة السيد رئيس مجلس السيادة الانتقالي، مطار الخرطوم، ومقر الإذاعة والتلفزيون. مع ذلك تزامنت هجمات على كل المطارات والمرافق الحيوية في ولايات السودان الأخرى. السيد الرئيس، إن ما يجري في السودان هو شأن داخلي، وما تقوم به القوات المسلحة السودانية هو الواجب الدستوري للجيوش في كل دول العالم. أكرر، إن ما تقوم به القوات المسلحة السودانية هو الواجب الدستوري للجيوش في كل دول العالم. إننا إذ نشكر لهذا المجلس اهتمامه ومتابعته الدؤوبة للتطورات المؤسفة الجارية في السودان، نؤكد في ذات الوقت أن موقفنا من هذه الجلسة الخاصة ومن أي ناتج عنها يستند إلى ما يلي. أولا، ودون ما انتقاص أو مساس بالأولوية المطلقة التي توليها حكومة السودان لحماية وتطوير حقوق الإنسان، إلا أنه وفي ظل هذا الظرف العصيب الذي تشهد فيه العاصمة الخرطوم اشتباكات مسلحة وسقوط مستمر للضحايا والجرحى، فإن الأولوية سيد الرئيس، الأولوية الملحة هي تحقيق وقف إطلاق النار وإنقاذ الأرواح أولا. وهذا يتسق مع الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان الذي جعل الحق في الحياة متقدما على كل الحقوق الأخرى، ثم تأتي بعد ذلك المسارات المهمة الأخرى. ثانيا، هناك جهود إقليمية جارية ومبشرة بإمكانية تحقيق وقف إطلاق النار والهدنة وقد تابعتم جميعا المفاوضات الجارية الآن بمدينة جدة بمبادرة كريمة من المملكة العربية السعودية الشقيقة والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وقبلها المبادرة الكريمة لهيئة إيجاد التي قررت إيفاء أصحاب الفخامة رؤساء كل من جنوب السودان، جيبوتي، كينيا إلى السودان بهذا الخصوص، وهي مبادرة مدعومة أيضا من الاتحاد الأفريقي والآلية الرباعية التي تضم المملكة العربية السعودية، الإمارات العربية المتحدة، الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا، وهي أيضا مبادرة مبشرة وتتسق تماما مع مبدأ الحلول الأفريقية للمشاكل الأفريقية. لذلك سيد الرئيس، فإن المطلوب هو إفساح المجال وإعطاء الوقت لهذه الجهود الإقليمية الجارية وعدم تجاوزها أو التأثير سلبا عليها. ثالثا، إن موضوع السودان منذ تمرد قوات الدعم السريع في 15 من أبريل المنصرم ما زال قيد النظر لدى مجلس الأمن بوصفه الجهاز القائم على صيانة الأمن والسلم الدوليين، وقد عقد المجلس حتى الآن 3 جلسات بشأن السودان، كان آخرها مشاورات الأمس تحت بند ما يستجد من أعمال، وما زال موضوع السودان قيد النظر والتداول الآن في مجلس الأمن. رابعا، إن السودان مدرج أصلا ضمن أجندة مجلس حقوق الإنسان، وهناك جلسة مقررة مسبقا بشأن السودان في يونيو المقبل ضمن أعمال الدورة العادية 53 بشأن السودان، ويفصلنا عن شهر يونيو المقبل أقل من 3 أسابيع. إذن فلماذا الاستعجال والاندفاع بعقد جلسة خاصة في هذا التوقيت، خاصة أنها لم تحظى بتأييد دولة واحدة من الدول الأفريقية أو العربية التي هي دول الانتماء المباشر للسودان. سيد الرئيس، إن حماية حقوق الإنسان وتطويرها ظلت وستبقى في مقدمة أولويات حكومة السودان، وهي بالنسبة لنا أجندة وطنية بالغة الأهمية، وليس مجرد مطلوبات تقوم بها الدولة إنفاذا لتفويض آليات حقوق الإنسان الدولية. سيد الرئيس، بالنظر إلى آليات حقوق الإنسان الموجودة الآن في السودان، أولا هناك مكتب الأمم المتحدة لحقوق الإنسان في السودان، وهو المكتب المنشأ بموجب اتفاقية مع حكومة السودان ويحظى بتعاون
I'm really sorry, but you have exhausted your 5 minutes.
إلى الخبير المعين ووحدة حقوق الإنسان ضمن بعثة يونيتام.
We will start with the list of speakers, and allow me to recall that the speaking time limit is 2 minutes and 30 seconds for council members and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observer states and other observers. And I thank you very much for your understanding that the rules are applicable to everyone. Starting with the list of speakers for member states of the Council, let me give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell, MP, Minister of State for Development and Africa, via Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we our solidarity with the people of Sudan. When the late Kofi Annan proposed the creation of this council, he asked for a body that could react in the very worst moments, a council that would respond quickly so we could help save lives. Since the 15th of April, Sudan has descended rapidly into crisis. Hundreds of civilians have been killed, thousands injured, humanitarian actors murdered. The risk of violence and atrocities against particular groups is rising. Millions more face shortages of food and medicine or have been forced to flee as refugees. The Secretary-General has warned that the effects of the wider region will be very severe indeed. But there is an alternative to conflict, to killing, to the suffering of totally innocent and blameless people. Despite the military takeover in 2021, Sudan had been on the path to democratic civilian rule. It was working with the UN human rights system to build domestic institutions, and it was making progress. Surely we must revert to the political track, so important and so evident on April the 11th. Dear colleagues, let us be the counsel of Mr. Annan's vision. Let's do all we can to help Sudan return to that path of peace, and let's do it now. We must send a united message of concern and of horror about the increase in human rights violations and abuses since the outbreak of the conflict. We must use our collective influence to break the cycle of impunity in Sudan, which only leads to further violence. There must be accountability for the horrific events taking place. Mr. President, I would like to express my appreciation for all those working tirelessly with the parties in Sudan to end the violence, colleagues from the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the Arab League, and United Nations, virtually the entire cohort of the international community. It is vital these efforts continue. To colleagues in the Council, I urge you to adopt today's draft resolution to express our united support for the human rights of the Sudanese people and to work together for a swift end to this terrible conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And now we will continue with Lebanon speaking on behalf of a group of Arab states. Lebanon, you have the floor.
السيد الرئيس، يشرفني تقديم هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية. تتابع المجموعة بقلق تطورات الأوضاع في السودان وتعبر عن تضامنها الكامل مع السودان وشعبه في هذه المرحلة الصعبة التي يمر بها. تولي المجموعة أهمية قصوى لوقف إطلاق النار وتسهيل نفاذ المساعدات الإنسانية، وترحب المجموعة بكافة المبادرات الدولية والإقليمية الجارية لإنهاء النزاع وأحداثها المباحثات الأولية بمدينة جدة في إطار المبادرة السعودية الأمريكية، وتدعو كافة الأطراف السودانية لمواصلة الحوار من أجل حل سياسي شامل يستجيب للتحديات الراهنة ويضع البلاد في المسار الصحيح نحو الانتقال إلى الديمقراطية وسيادة القانون. كما تدعو المجموعة المجتمع الدولي إلى تشجيع الحوار وإرسال الرسائل التي تساعد على تحقيق التوافق السياسي بين الأطراف وتعزيز الاستقرار خلال الفترة الانتقالية وصولا إلى إجراء الانتخابات حرة ونزيهة ومراقبة دوليا، وتؤكد ضرورة احترام مبادئ السيادة الوطنية للسودان ووحدة أراضيه واستقلاله السياسي ودعم الملكية السودانية للعملية السياسية. تعيد المجموعة التأكيد على موقفها الداعم للسودان بصفتها الدولة المعنية وما أعربت عنه من شواغل حول عقد هذه الدورة ومشروع القرار المطروح، وتشدد على أن المجلس يجب أن يأخذ بعين الاعتبار موقف الدولة المعنية لا سيما عند إنشاء آليات جديدة أو التوسع في ولاية آليات قائمة بالفعل، خاصة في ظل تعاون السودان المستمر مع المجلس وآلياته المختلفة على مدار السنوات الماضية. كما تأسف المجموعة لتحميل مشروع القرار المطروح لغة وموضوعات خلافية لم يتسنى لهذا المجلس تحقيق التوافق بشأنها في السابق، وتتطلب دراستها مزيدا من الوقت والتشاور. هذا وتحث المجموعة مكتب المفوض السامي لتقديم كل أشكال الدعم الفني للسودان من أجل دعم مسيرته في مجال تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
In order to help it along the way to ensuring respect for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Sweden, on behalf of the European Union.
Mr. President, the European Union is gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Sudan. The impact of the conflict, not least on women, children and persons already in vulnerable situations, including increased level of SGBV, is deeply concerning. The humanitarian needs are at an all-time high and are expected to increase. The political crisis and continued fighting have drastically reduced the options for an operational response to these growing needs. For these reasons, all EU member states supported the request for this session. The EU strongly condemns the fighting between Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, which fundamentally threatens the safety and security of the people of Sudan, as well as the unity and stability of the country and the region. We appeal to all parties to silence the guns immediately and hostilities without preconditions and fully abide by ceasefire efforts. We call on all actors to protect civilians and refrain from attacks on civilian infrastructure, including schools, healthcare facilities, and humanitarian warehouses. International human rights law and IHL must be respected. The EU calls on all actors to allow and facilitate rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as to protect civilians, especially children, and ensure the safety of humanitarians, medical, and also diplomatic personnel. Ensuring their safety is the responsibility of the authorities. The fighting must end to guarantee their protection and allow space for inclusive dialogue and mediation. The EU welcomes and supports all efforts for dialogue and mediation in order to end the current conflict and facilitate a return to the path of democracy, including those of the UN, AU, IGAD, the League of Arab States, as well as initiatives by Saudi Arabia and the US and South Sudan. All efforts must respect the aspirations of the people in Sudan for a peaceful, stable and democratic future with respect for human rights and the rule of law. External actors must refrain from fueling the conflict. The EU fully supports the work of the OHCHR and the designated expert in Sudan. The EU reaffirms its steadfast support and solidarity with the people of Sudan who led the peaceful revolution in 2019 and whose aspirations remain critical even under such duress. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Finland on behalf of a group of countries. Finland.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We call on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to immediately stop violence and hostilities, commit to a ceasefire and return to a peaceful dialogue with full respect for human rights law and international humanitarian law. We call on the parties to allow and facilitate immediate return to full and unimpeded humanitarian access and for civilians to move safely. As reporting on grave violations and abuses of human rights in Sudan is increasing, we underline the impact of the conflict on civilians, especially women, children, and persons in vulnerable situations, such as persons with disabilities. We are concerned over sexual and gender-based violence and the negative impacts on upholding sexual and reproductive health and rights. The neighboring countries of Sudan have taken on life-saving work in hosting the hundreds of thousands of persons who have left the country. The longer the conflict continues, the more detrimental its impacts will be on everyone, particularly children. According to UNICEF, at least 190 children have been killed and more than 1,700 injured thus far. Furthermore, access to life-saving health services, including vaccination programs, as well as to water and sanitation services and to nutrition, is jeopardized. We urge all parties to the conflict to do their utmost to protect children. These children are the future of the country. Finally, we welcome the strengthening of the mandate of the designated expert and the OHCHR as proposed in the resolution. Accountability for violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law remains crucial. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Oman, speaking on behalf of Gulf Cooperation Council.
السيد الرئيس، ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن الدول الأعضاء في مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية. تتابع دول مجلس التعاون بقلق تطورات الأوضاع بالسودان الشقيق وتعبر عن تضامنها الكامل مع السودان في هذه الظروف الاستثنائية والمرحلة الصعبة التي يمر بها. كما تدعو في هذا السياق إلى التهدئة وضبط النفس وتغليب لغة الحوار وصوت الحكمة وتوحيد الصف والانخراط في حوار سلمي بهدف إعادة الاستقرار السياسي والتعافي الاقتصادي والازدهار للسودان وشعبه. ترحب دول المجلس بالمباحثات الدولية الجارية في مدينة جدة في إطار المبادرة التي تقودها المملكة العربية السعودية والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وتأتي نتاج تكاتف دولي بجهود حثيثة مع الشركاء من دول المجموعة الرباعية والشركاء من الآلية الثلاثية وهيئة إيجاد، والتي تهدف إلى وصول إلى هدنة ووقف إطلاق النار وتسهيل وصول المساعدات الإنسانية، كما ترحب بكافة المبادرات الإقليمية التي تهدف إلى إنهاء الأزمة والتوصل لاتفاق بين القوى السياسية وإعادة الأمن والاستقرار للسودان. السيد الرئيس، تجدد دول مجلس التعاون تأكيدها على أهمية الحفاظ على تماسك الدولة ومؤسساتها ومساندة السودان في تحقيق تطلعات شعبه الشقيق، وتدعو في هذا السياق المجتمع الدولي إلى تشجيع الحوار وإرسال الرسائل التي تساعد على تحقيق التوافق السياسي بين كافة الأطراف، وتعزيز الاستقرار خلال هذه الفترة الانتقالية. كما تدعو دول المجلس لضرورة التأكيد والتقيد بمبادئ احترام السيادة الوطنية للسودان ووحدة أراضيه واستقلاله السياسي وبملكية السودان للعملية السياسية واحترام رؤيته في هذا الصدد. ختاما، تؤكد دول المجلس التعاون على استمرار دعمها للسودان بما في ذلك مساهمتها الإنسانية والإغاثية وتسهيلها لعمليات الإجلاء، وتشيد في هذا السياق بمساهمات الدول الأخرى والمنظمات الدولية بتقديم مساعدات إنسانية عاجلة. كما تدعو من هذا المنبر لتكثيف الجهود من أجل توفير مزيد من المساعدات الإنسانية والطبية العاجلة لسد احتياجات الشعب السوداني والحيلولة دون تفاقم الأوضاع الإنسانية. كما تؤكد من جهة ثانية على أهمية تقديم المكتب المفوض السامي لكافة أشكال الدعم الفني للجهات المعنية بتعزيز حقوق الإنسان في السودان. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
The High Commissioner's Office to promote human rights in the country.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. High Commissioner, Germany aligns itself to the EU statement. As we convene here in Geneva today, the human rights of the people of Sudan are violated. Innocent women, children and men are running out of water and food, are left without access to health care and are losing their lives. International humanitarian law is repeatedly broken, and I do thank the High Commissioner for his clear words in this room today. It is very clear. Human rights also apply in times of conflict, and international humanitarian law must be respected. This is why, together with the core group, we have called for this special session. The high number of states supporting today's session proves one thing: the international community is steadfast in its support of the people of Sudan and their struggle for freedom, peace, and justice. We do support all initiatives to restore peace. Peace is urgently needed. But let me say one thing also very clearly. Lasting peace and the respect for human rights go hand in hand. The conflict is jeopardizing the safety and security of the Sudanese people, the stability of the country and the region. The humanitarian situation is appalling. There is a clear risk of further escalation of the conflict with even more grave impacts for civilians. And Germany therefore urges all sides to immediately cease fire, protect civilians, and refrain from attacks on civilian infrastructure. Access for humanitarian help is urgently needed. In 2019, the people of Sudan stood up. They toppled a dictatorship and ever since have peacefully been fighting for a peaceful future for Sudan. Two generals are crushing this aspiration right now, and Germany urges to step back from the brink and set Sudan back on tracks towards a civilian-led democratic government. Germany therefore supports the efforts of the UN, the African Union, IGAD, as well as the US-Saudi initiative for dialogue and mediation in pursuit of a return for a civilian-led transition, peace and stability. Today is the moment for us here in Geneva to act. The resolution is a call for peace, for human rights. Let us join hands together and vote in favor of peace of this resolution. We owe it to the people of Sudan.
Thank you very much. And let me invite Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine is deeply concerned with the developments in the Sudan in the wake of a serious outbreak of conflict, which has already left hundreds of civilians dead and thousands wounded. The escalation of violence across the country since 15 April has aggravated the already hazardous humanitarian situation. According to OCHA, humanitarian needs have reached record levels. The continuous attacks on medical and humanitarian facilities and staff have endangered humanitarian operations. Dozens of settlements have been destroyed, and thousands of people have been internally and externally displaced. Access to health care continues to be severely impacted by the conflict. My government has evacuated more than 100 Ukrainians as well as third country nationals from the Sudan in the conditions of incessant fighting, no electricity, scarce food, water and medicine. This appalling human rights situation in the Sudan needs urgent attention by the international community, including this Council. We echo the relevant messages of concern made by UN Secretary General, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Council special procedures The parties must implement an immediate ceasefire and allow the humanitarian access without preconditions. Violence, intimidation, and harassment of the Sudanese people must be stopped. All perpetrators must be brought to account. We call upon all actors in the Sudan to take immediate actions to restore respect for human rights and humanitarian law, to refrain from further violations, assaults, and abuses, and to begin a dialogue to resolve the crisis. We support all relevant international mediation efforts in this regard. Ukraine underlines the importance of the Council's proper response to the evolving human rights situation in the Sudan and fully supports the draft resolution under consideration. This Council action is needed to put an end to the sufferings of the Sudanese people who crave for a just peace. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Paraguay.
Gracias, presidente. En primer lugar, expresamos nuestro pesar por la situación y por las más de 500 muertes en los últimos días, así como nuestra preocupación por la escalada de violencia y el deterioro de la situación de los derechos humanos en Sudán. De todos los sectores, la población civil es, una vez más, la más afectada, en particular ante el uso indiscriminado de armas explosivas en áreas urbanas, que han causado la pérdida de vidas y propiedades civiles, dañando estructura crítica y dejando a millones sin acceso a necesidades básicas. Por ello pedimos a todas las partes involucradas trabajar denodadamente para detener inmediatamente la violencia y sobre todo respetar la vida de los civiles y detener el uso de armas indiscriminadas en áreas urbanas pobladas. Exhortamos a las autoridades de Sudán a garantizar la seguridad y a cumplir con su deber de proteger los derechos de las personas, y confiamos en que honrará sus compromisos y asegurará la pronta realización de investigaciones transparentes, llegado el momento. Señor presidente, las últimas semanas en Sudán han demostrado la necesidad de fortalecer el escrutinio internacional sobre la situación en el terreno. Es necesario adoptar medidas para disuadir abusos a la población civil y actuar para hacer que los responsables luego rindan cuenta. El grave contexto descrito tanto por el secretario general Guterres como el Alto Comisionado, señor Türk, ha impulsado a mi delegación a apoyar la convocatoria a esta sesión especial en el entendido de que este Consejo es el espacio apropiado para abordar las denuncias recibidas sobre las violaciones de los derechos humanos. Confiamos en el rol protagónico que tiene la Unión Africana en este delicado escenario y que los demás órganos de las Naciones Unidas harán también la labor que les compete ante estas circunstancias, como el Consejo de Seguridad. Los esfuerzos de este órgano deben apuntar a dar alivio, a ofrecer respuestas y acciones concretas en favor de las víctimas de violaciones de los derechos humanos que siguen esperando respuesta de la comunidad internacional. Finalmente, presidente, el Paraguay confía en que los mecanismos establecidos por el Sistema Universal de los Derechos Humanos cuentan con las herramientas adecuadas para cumplir con los propósitos por los cuales los Estados hemos acordado la creación de este Consejo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite Argentina.
Gracias, presidente. El secretario general de las Naciones Unidas y su representante especial, el Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos, agencias de las Naciones Unidas, el Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja, han sido claros en transmitir su preocupación por la situación actual de los derechos humanos y humanitaria en Sudán. E informan de ataques de las fuerzas combatientes a la población civil y a la infraestructura civil, incluyendo escuelas y hospitales, lo que trajo como resultado la escasez aguda de alimentos, agua, electricidad, combustible y acceso limitado a la atención médica. En este contexto nos preocupan los miles de heridos y cientos de muertes, el aumento de los niveles de violencia sexual y de género, las restricciones a la asistencia humanitaria impuestas por las fuerzas combatientes y los ataques contra los trabajadores humanitarios, así como contra las instalaciones y los miembros de las organizaciones internacionales, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y la comunidad diplomática. Esta violencia debe cesar de manera inmediata. Instamos a todas las partes en el conflicto a que respeten plenamente los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario, permitan el acceso inmediato y sin trabas de la ayuda humanitaria y protejan a los civiles. Sudán, como Estado miembro del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, está obligado a mantener los más altos estándares en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Instamos al gobierno de Sudán a que continúe y refuerce su colaboración con el experto en derechos Derechos Humanos en Sudán, la Unión Africana, la Autoridad Intergubernamental para el Desarrollo, la Comisión Africana de Derechos Humanos y de los Pueblos y la Liga de los Estados Árabes, los procedimientos especiales temáticos del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y los órganos de tratados de las Naciones Unidas. Exhortamos a todas las partes en el conflicto a que cesen inmediatamente las hostilidades, se adhieran a un alto el fuego y regresen al proceso de transición a un gobierno dirigido por civiles. Es imperioso contribuir a que este Consejo tenga los elementos necesarios para cooperar y asistir a Sudán a cumplir con sus obligaciones internacionales en materia humanitaria y de derechos humanos, lo que constituye uno de los objetivos claves de esta sesión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Excellency. Now let me invite Cameroon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, le Cameroun est profondément préoccupé par la situation de crise actuelle au Soudan. Mon pays est meurtri par les souffrances indicibles que vivent les populations du Soudan du fait de ce regain de tensions. Mon pays appelle à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et à un règlement pacifique de la crise et invite les belligérants à créer des conditions pour que l'assistance humanitaire puisse convenablement se déployer dans le pays afin de secourir ceux qui sont dans la souffrance et la détresse. Le Cameroun du reste salue les bonnes dispositions des autorités soudanaises en place, affichées depuis leur arrivée au pouvoir, en faveur du dialogue et de la coopération avec les mécanismes onusiens en charge des droits de l'homme. Il les encourage à persévérer dans cet élan pour ramener définitivement la paix et le vivre ensemble dans l'intérêt du développement du Soudan. Par ailleurs, mon pays félicite toutes les initiatives qui visent à ramener la paix au Soudan, notamment les Nations Unies, les initiatives régionales conduites par l'IGAD sous les auspices de l'Union africaine, de la Ligue arabe et bien d'autres. À cet égard, le Cameroun se félicite de l'action du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, de son intérêt et de sa forte implication visant à protéger et à prévenir les violations des droits de l'homme. Cependant, mon pays estime que, dans sa dimension de la promotion des droits de l'homme, le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme devrait mettre un accent dans le renforcement de l'état de droit et de la promotion de la démocratie, car la résurgence des crises traduit un déficit de démocratie. Enfin, mon pays estime que la résolution devant sanctionner cette session spéciale doit envoyer un message qui favorise la paix et diminue les haines au Soudan. Dans ce sens, elle doit être équilibrée et consensuelle et prendre en compte les attentes et les espoirs de la population cible, qui sont la principale cible de toutes les violations des droits de l'homme. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci à vous. Morocco.
شكرا سيد رئيس. بدء يتمن وفد المملكة المغربية الجهود الراسخة التي تقوم بها دولة السودان الشقيقة في تعاملها الجاد مع المكتب المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان وكذا مع مجلس حقوق الإنسان وآلياته المختصة. كما يؤيد وفد بلادي التأكيد على التضامن المملكة المغربية المطلق مع الشعب السوداني والتعبير عن أسفه لما آلت إليه الأوضاع المأساوية في هذا البلد الشقيق. كما يؤكد وفد بلدي دعم المغرب لمبادرات وخطوات جامعة الدول العربية بما في ذلك إرسال مساعدة إنسانية مرحبا في الوقت ذاته بالمساعي التي اطلعت بها دول أخرى وبعض المنظمات الدولية لتقريب بين الأطراف وتهيئة الظروف الملائمة للبدء في حوار بناء. نطلع إلى أن الأوضاع ستمكن من صون أمن واستقرار السودان الشقيق ووحدته الترابية وسيادته الوطنية والحفاظ على مقدرات الشعب الفلسطيني، وذلك من خلال تغليب الحكمة وعودة السريعة إلى المسار السلمي لحل الأزمة السودانية وتأسيس لمرحلة جديدة تلبي طموحات وتطلعات الشعب السوداني في دولة الحق وتسهم في تعزيز الأمن والاستقرار السياسي والاقتصاد في هذا البلد الهام. في نفس السياق نطالب من كل الأطراف وبإلحاح إلى الوقف الفوري لكافة الاشتباكات المسلحة. وفي الختام سيد الرئيس، لا يفوتنا أن نتقدم بالشكر إلى كل الأطراف التي ساهمت وعملت على تنسيق توفير مسارات آمنة سواء جوية أو بحرية أو برية من أجل ضمان إجلاء المدنيين العزل وطواقم دبلوماسيين إلى أوطانهم أو إلى أماكن آمنة خارج مناطق النزاع. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. And let me invite Belgium.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique se joint à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Si le peuple soudanais subit depuis plusieurs semaines les lourdes conséquences humanitaires de ce conflit, ses droits fondamentaux sont bafoués depuis bien plus longtemps. En 2019, un mouvement fort de millions de personnes avait eu le courage de se lever pour réclamer de meilleures conditions de vie et le respect de ses droits civils et politiques. Cette transition n'a malheureusement pas pu encore aboutir. Au contraire, les combats qui sévissent sur le territoire depuis le 15 avril ont déjà tué et blessé des centaines de civils et contraint des milliers de personnes au déplacement à l'intérieur et à l'extérieur du Soudan. La Belgique appelle les belligérants à mettre un terme au conflit et à mettre en place les conditions nécessaires pour un retour au dialogue et à une transition civile juste et inclusive, conformément à la volonté du peuple soudanais. Nous condamnons les raids aériens aveugles, l'exploitation des infrastructures civiles à des fins de guerre et le pillage généralisé. Plus les combats se poursuivent, plus le risque est élevé de voir la situation se transformer en guerre civile, avec de graves répercussions régionales. Nous nous félicitons donc que le Conseil de sécurité et les acteurs régionaux aient fait preuve d'unité dans leur opposition à ce conflit. Nous soutenons les initiatives de médiation avec un ancrage régional. Cela n'exclut toutefois pas la nécessité urgente pour ce Conseil de réagir à la grave situation des droits humains au Soudan. L'absence de respect pour les droits humains contribuera à l'aggravation de la situation et nous éloignera de toute solution durable. Enfin, nous apprécions la coopération du Soudan avec le Bureau des droits de l'homme, tant à Khartoum qu'ailleurs dans le pays. Compte tenu de la crise actuelle, la Belgique estime qu'il est logique à présent de renforcer le soutien à l'expert indépendant afin de prévenir de nouvelles violations des droits humains. Nous appelons tous les membres du Conseil à soutenir le peuple soudanais, à maintenir l'unité de la communauté internationale et à approuver cette résolution par consensus. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the High Commissioner for his sobering remarks. They are a stark reminder of the terrible human toll this latest conflict has had on the people of Sudan. Hundreds of civilians are dead and thousands wounded. Countless more have been suffering for weeks, unable to leave their homes for food, water, fuel, medicine, treatment, or to check on loved ones. They live in constant fear of the next bomb dropped, the next bullet fired, the next knock at the door. To the people of Sudan, I say, we stand with you and for you. We will not give up on you, nor will we turn away. We cannot let the people of Sudan lose hope. It was this hope that inspired us in 2019 when the people rose to reclaim the destiny of Sudan after decades of misrule. The people of Sudan deserve better. It is our responsibility to listen, to amplify their voices, and to push for peace. At the same time, we must demand full respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and that parties to the conflict respect and protect civilians, including humanitarian personnel. We certainly should all agree that any attack or threat against humanitarian and health workers is unacceptable. I am horrified and deeply concerned by reports of targeting of hospitals and healthcare providers, forced recruitment of children, and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. We acknowledge those who say the world should wait longer to address the human rights and humanitarian aspects of this tragedy. However, the U.S. is of the clear view that negotiations to establish a ceasefire and get desperately needed humanitarian assistance flowing to the people of Sudan can and must occur at the same time that our Council fulfills its role and mandate in addressing the dire human rights situation. In fact, this is the moment to send a clear message to the parties of the conflict that the world is watching and expects them to deliver for the people of Sudan. Parties to the conflict need to ensure safe humanitarian access and the protection of civilians, and here at the HRC we have a duty to help make that more likely. I would like to ask the panel, what can be done to strengthen protection of civilians to include members of all vulnerable groups? I thank you.
Thank you. La France, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, la France s'associe à l'intervention de l'Union européenne et remercie le haut-commissaire et la présidente du comité de coordination pour leur présentation lucide de la situation et l'appel à une action urgente. Nous exprimons notre vive préoccupation s'agissant des combats en cours au Soudan. Nos premières pensées vont aux victimes civiles dont le nombre ne cesse de croître. Nous condamnons les violences indiscriminées dont elles sont la cible, tout comme les attaques contre le personnel humanitaire et les agents des Nations Unies. Le ciblage intentionnel d'infrastructures essentielles, dont des hôpitaux, est inacceptable. Cette situation entraîne d'importants mouvements de population à l'intérieur du Soudan et vers les pays voisins. Des millions de civils voient l'accès à leurs droits fondamentaux menacés, voire annihilés. La priorité est l'arrêt des combats, la sécurité des civils et des travailleurs humanitaires, l'accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave. Nous appelons l'ensemble des forces politiques soudanaises à ne pas prendre part au combat. Nous saluons l'engagement des Nations Unies, de l'Union africaine, de plusieurs pays de la région, notamment le Soudan du Sud et l'Arabie saoudite, de l'IGAD, de la Ligue arabe et des États-Unis en faveur d'une cessation des hostilités. Seul un dialogue apaisé peut permettre de progresser vers le respect d'un cessez-le-feu permanent et de négociations politiques inclusives afin d'identifier une sortie de crise. Monsieur le Président, la tenue de cette session extraordinaire est un signal clair de la communauté internationale. Le respect des droits de l'homme et des libertés fondamentales, la protection des civils, le retour d'une paix durable vont ensemble. Dans ce contexte, nous appelons en particulier à la protection des journalistes et des défenseurs des droits. La consolidation de la paix doit s'appuyer sur un processus de justice impartial et transparent. Les auteurs d'exactions devront rendre des comptes. Cela est essentiel pour éviter la répétition des cycles de violence et répondre aux besoins de justice des victimes. C'est pourquoi nous comparénons cette résolution qui prévoit un suivi renforcé de la situation et une documentation des exactions. Et c'est pourquoi nous appelons à la reprise du processus qui avait commencé en 2019 et qui doit se poursuivre vers le rétablissement de la démocratie. La force apportera une aide humanitaire exceptionnelle pour répondre à cette crise et à la demande de soutien des pays voisins du Soudan, accueillant en solidarité, nous le saluons, des populations civiles forcées de fuir à cause des combats. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Now let me invite Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia is following closely the situation in Sudan. We remain deeply concerned over the continued fighting in Sudan and strongly condemn the hostilities which have caused destruction of properties and loss of innocent lives. Thus far, the conflict has resulted in hundreds of civilian casualties and tens of thousands more have been displaced. We are concerned that a prolonged conflict will only lead to further suffering for the Sudanese people. Malaysia is of the view that the immediate priority for the situation in Sudan is to end the violence and instability in the country. Therefore, Malaysia believes that inclusive dialogue and negotiations are the only means to restore peace and stability in Sudan. We urge both parties to engage in meaningful dialogue while safeguarding the interests of the Sudanese people, to ensure ceasefire and to work towards a peaceful resolution. Malaysia commends Saudi Arabia's efforts in facilitating peace talks to reach immediate and lasting ceasefire in Sudan. In this regard, we welcome the ongoing pre-negotiation talks between the representatives of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces mediated by Saudi Arabia and the United States in Jeddah. In this regard, Malaysia stands ready to support regional and international mediation efforts to return Sudan to the path of peace. Mr. President, Malaysia is deeply concerned with the dire humanitarian conditions in Sudan, including food shortages, as well as limited access to healthcare, transportation, communications, and other basic necessities. Therefore, we underline the need for establishment of humanitarian corridors and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance into and throughout Sudan. We urge all parties to grant access to humanitarian aid and medical supplies and fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. As the situation remains volatile, we urge all parties in Sudan to prioritize the safety and security of civilians, including the vulnerable groups. We also call on all parties to allow a safe evacuation process for foreign citizens. Malaysia would like to take this opportunity to thank all parties involved in the safe evacuation of 33 Malaysians and 27 other citizens, especially Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Pakistan. Finally, Malaysia remains in solidarity with the people of Sudan and will continue to support efforts towards finding a peaceful and amicable solution to the ongoing conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. The Czech Republic is deeply concerned by the recent outbreak of violence in Sudan. The human rights situation in the country is catastrophic. We don't know yet how many persons have been killed and wounded during the ongoing conflict. The numbers will be high. We are worried that it will be many more than the reported hundreds of victims. We are concerned that the current situation might evolve into a long-term conflict affecting the whole country. We call on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to immediately stop the fighting and respect the ceasefire. The situation in Sudan cannot be solved by an armed conflict. Access of humanitarian aid must be facilitated. Civilians must be protected. It is unacceptable to conduct attacks on schools and healthcare facilities in the armed conflict. The situation is showing us the fragility of states in democratic transition. Just a few years ago, we expressed our support to the efforts of the transitional government to improve the human rights situation in Sudan and to lead Sudan to democratic elections. It is unfortunate that the positive developments in the country were stopped by the 2021 coup, and only 2 years later we are witnessing these hostilities. For these reasons, the Czech Republic has supported the submitted resolution, and we hope it will be adopted by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Montenegro.
Mr. President, Montenegro shares serious concerns about the grave human rights situation in Sudan, exacerbated by the outbreak of the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Force on April 15. A significant escalation of violence has already led to the death of hundreds of civilians and injuries to thousands, including children. The ongoing fighting is also plagued by the increased levels of sexual and gender-based violence, mass displacement, and destruction of property and civilian infrastructure. The outbreak of hostilities has further increased food insecurity and threatened access to vital life facilities, including education and healthcare services, water and sanitation. It has deteriorated the already dire situation of millions of people, approximately a third population, in need of humanitarian assistance. Overall, heightened violence in Sudan threatened the safety and security of its people, as well as the unity and stability of the country. Any further escalation of the conflict could be devastating for the country and efforts to restore the civilian-led transition towards democracy as the only path to freedom, peace, and justice for all Sudanese. These reversing developments also risk regional destabilization. We strongly condemn the ongoing fighting and all relating reported violence and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict across the country. We join the common appeal to all parties for immediate cessation of hostilities without preconditions and full respect for the ceasefire efforts. We further call on all actors to allow and facilitate swift and unimpeded humanitarian access to and evacuation of civilians, as well as to protect them and assure the safety of humanitarian, international, and diplomatic personnel. Montenegro extends its full support to all ongoing efforts aimed at backing dialogue and mediation towards returning to the path of democracy. For all these reasons, Montenegro supported the core group's request for convening the special session on the human rights impact of the ongoing conflict in Sudan. We thank the core group for its constructive engagement during the consultation on the tabled resolution on this matter and call for its adoption. Montenegro reiterates its staunch support and solidarity with the Sudanese people and shares their hopes and aspirations for achieving lasting peace, stability, justice, and democracy. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of China.
Mr.
President,
中方关注苏丹局势最新的发展，
latest developments in Sudan.
呼吁冲突双方以国家和人民利益为重，尽快实现停火，为开展人道救援创造有利条件，避免局势进一步升级。我们坚定支持苏丹主权、独立和领土完整，相信苏丹有智慧、有能力处理好内部事务，尽快平息冲突， 重回和平稳定和国家发展的正确轨道。我们赞赏阿盟、非盟等地区组织和有关地区国家为应对苏丹局势发挥的关键作用。 我们注意到，冲突双方已经在沙特启动谈判进程。国际社会应当切实尊重苏丹的主权和主导权，支持苏丹探索符合本国国情的制度安排，为对话解决问题创造有利的外部环境。人权理事会涉苏丹局势的有关讨论和行动，都应当有助于灭火降温，而不是相反。我们一贯主张，各方应当通过建设性对话与合作处理人权领域里的分歧。因此，我们不赞成举行此次特别会议，更不赞成在各方仍存在严重分歧的情况下采取行动，以免对人权理事会的工作造成深远的消极影响。谢谢主席先生。
I thank you. And let me invite Pakistan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned over the evolving situation in Sudan, especially its humanitarian, and security dimensions. We are saddened over the loss of lives. Our thoughts and solidarity are with the brotherly people of Sudan affected by the ongoing conflict. We reaffirm support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan, and we fully support all mediation efforts, including by the African Union, League of Arab States, the Quartet, and IGAD. We hope the recent meeting in Jeddah, facilitated by Saudi Arabia, lays the foundation for a durable peace. Mr. President, holding of a special session of the Council, in our view, does not stand up to the broad markers identified in the IB package. We raise this point in terms of principles of objectivity, dialogue, and cooperation. This session is also in contradiction to working culture envisaged in HRC Resolution 5/1, such as exercising restraint in proliferation of mandates and avoiding unnecessary duplication of work. In our view, the UN Security Council is already seized of the peace and security dimension of the situation. It has issued a PRST, and despite it being vested with the mandate and tools, it has exercised prudence by deferring consideration of the situation till next month. At this stage, mediation efforts must be given primacy to secure ceasefire and facilitate humanitarian assistance. We share concerns over the human rights impacts of the conflict in Sudan. These impacts can, however, best be mitigated when the ongoing conflict is managed first. Sudan has demonstrated consistent cooperation and engagement with the Council, OHCHR, and human rights experts, including the existing mechanism. Mounting another resolution with novel but unrealistic proposals is deemed unhelpful. After all, many of the asks are hard to be achieved given the security situation on the ground and the inherent limitations of this Council. In any case, the human rights expert on Sudan is set to present his report, followed by an interactive dialogue in a few weeks. The call for today's special session and its outcomes, which lack the consent of country concerned, on a matter which sequentially falls within the mandate of UN Security Council, risks further exacerbating the situation in Sudan. We call for introspection and to work with the country concerned to promote the shared cause of a peaceful Sudan where human rights are fully respected by all. I thank you.
And now let me invite Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Chile expresa su grave preocupación por el dramático deterioro de la situación de derechos humanos en Sudán durante el último mes, desde el inicio de los enfrentamientos armados entre las fuerzas de apoyo rápido y las fuerzas armadas sudanesas el 15 de abril. Llamamos a todas las partes involucradas a intensificar sus esfuerzos por alcanzar un cese al fuego, proteger a la población civil, permitir el acceso de ayuda humanitaria y respetar las normas del derecho internacional, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Hacemos un llamado especial a atender la grave situación de mujeres, niños y niñas desplazados por el conflicto, en especial ante reportes de situaciones que ponen en riesgo su vida e integridad física, la carencia de servicios básicos y los casos de violencia sexual y de género. Estas circunstancias requieren de una respuesta sólida y coordinada por parte de la comunidad internacional para garantizar el respeto y la protección de los derechos humanos en Sudán. Asimismo, Chile manifiesta su respaldo a Sudán para alcanzar una solución pacífica al conflicto que permita la paz duradera y el bienestar de su población. Con dicho fin, destacamos el rol constructivo de las organizaciones internacionales en este proceso, particularmente la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos y los procedimientos especiales que mandata este Consejo, los que pueden coordinarse con otras agencias de Naciones Unidas y mecanismos regionales como la Unión Africana y la Liga Árabe. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Mexico.
Gracias, presidente. México hace patente su preocupación sobre el deterioro de la situación humanitaria y de derechos humanos en la República de Sudán. La información sobre la situación en terreno muestra la imperiosa necesidad de una discusión profunda en este Consejo, razón por la cual mi país respaldó la celebración de esta sesión especial. México reconoce los esfuerzos realizados por actores nacionales, regionales e internacionales para poner un alto al fuego y al conflicto. Sin embargo, ante la situación actual, mi país hace un llamado a todas las partes en el conflicto al cese inmediato de las hostilidades, a alcanzar una solución negociada y a retomar el camino al proceso de transición que permita el cabal cumplimiento de las obligaciones en materia de derechos humanos y de derecho internacional humanitario. Una paz sostenida, así como la salvaguarda de los derechos humanos, en especial de aquellos grupos más vulnerables, debe ser la prioridad. A la luz de la información sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en la República de Sudán, hemos analizado con detenimiento la resolución que se presenta también el día de hoy. Saludamos que se adopte un enfoque progresivo de los mecanismos previamente establecidos, que es un elemento que reiteradamente ha solicitado mi país a este Consejo. Sin embargo, mi país se permite destacar que la urgencia de la situación humanitaria de derechos humanos en un país o región determinada no debe de obligar a este Consejo a adoptar resoluciones que dejen de lado la creación de un diálogo constructivo con el Estado concernido, incluyendo elementos de su preocupación o prioridad. El fallar en esto no solo puede reducir la efectividad de los mecanismos propuestos, sino que abandona un enfoque de colaboración y respeto que debe prevalecer como eje central en el actuar de este Consejo para que los Estados puedan cumplir con sus obligaciones de derecho internacional, de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has long-standing friendly relations with Sudan and its people. Over the years, India has emerged as a development partner of Sudan and has assisted Sudan in implementing several projects through grants and concessional lines of credit, doing capacity building and providing humanitarian assistance. We are closely monitoring the complex and evolving security situation in Sudan. We are concerned over the loss of civilian lives, injuries, and destruction. The conflict has also negatively affected the enjoyment of human rights by people of Sudan. We have been coordinating closely with various partners for the safe movement of those Indians who were impacted by the conflict and wanted to be evacuated. And we have been able to safely evacuate about 4,000 Indian nationals, as well as nationals of other countries from Sudan, in coordination with our partners. India has been consistently underscoring the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation to resolve the conflict in Sudan. We have urged all sides to exercise restraint and work together to build trust and confidence, which would pave the way for dialogue and transition towards a civilian-led government. Peace and stability in Sudan is of utmost importance for India, for the entire African continent, and for the world. Mr. President, India hopes to see Sudan emerge as a prosperous, peaceful, and stable country, And towards that objective, we will continue to support Sudan and its people. We remain confident that the people of Sudan will overcome the current challenges and make progress towards securing a stable and prosperous future. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. And now let me invite Senegal.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Le Sénégal exprime toute sa solidarité envers le Soudan et son peuple. Ma délégation demeure profondément préoccupée par la reprise des violences récemment observées dans certaines régions du pays, qui a entraîné de nombreux déplacements de personnes, des destructions de biens et d'infrastructures ainsi que des pertes en vie humaine. Cette situation qui met en péril tous les efforts considérables déployés en faveur de la paix et de la stabilité au Soudan requiert une attention particulière de la part de la communauté internationale. À cet égard, le Sénégal salue les initiatives de médiation régionale prises par l'IGAD, appuyées par l'Union africaine, et celles menées par un groupe d'États, notamment l'Arabie saoudite, les Émirats arabes unis, le Royaume-Uni et les États-Unis d'Amérique. Et appelle également les parties impliquées dans le conflit à s'engager pleinement dans ce dialogue pour une cessation immédiate des hostilités ainsi que le respect total des droits humains et la protection des populations civiles, y compris les couches vulnérables. En outre, mon pays voudrait inviter le Conseil et la communauté internationale à fournir au Soudan l'assistance nécessaire en vue de répondre aux besoins humanitaires urgents des populations touchées par le conflit et de rétablir la sécurité et la stabilité sur toute l'étendue du territoire. En conclusion, tout en saluant la constante collaboration du Soudan avec les mécanismes du Conseil, le Sénégal réaffirme son engagement pour une résolution pacifique et durable de ce conflit dans le cadre d'un dialogue constructif avec le pays concerné. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Vietnam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Vietnam shares the international community's concerns about the conflict situation in Sudan and urges all parties to cease fire, observe international humanitarian law, ensure access to humanitarian aid, and safeguard civilians and essential infrastructure vital to human life. The immediate priority is finding a solution to end the conflict. The efforts of the international community should contribute to this goal within the most appropriate security, peace, and humanitarian frameworks consistent with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Vietnam believes that conflict resolution requires the participation of Sudanese stakeholders and the promotion of the role of the United Nations and regional organizations. An armed conflict related to international peace and security should be discussed in an appropriate mechanism. We reiterate our consistent position that Vietnam does not support country-specific resolutions that lack the consent of the concerned country and opposes the politicization of human rights issues as a tool to interfere in the internal affairs of country, which is inconsistent with international law and the principles set forth in the UN Charter. Vietnam strongly believes that the optimal way to promote and protect human rights is through genuine dialogue and cooperation. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And we continue with Costa Rica.
Gracias, presidente. Costa Rica se encuentra profundamente preocupada por el acelerado deterioro de la situación de derechos humanos de la población en Sudán. Mi país, siendo fiel, congruente y consistente con sus compromisos como miembro de este Consejo, desea reiterar su posición de principio, que los derechos humanos son universales, indivisibles e interdependientes y que ningún país, región o situación está por encima del escrutinio del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Por este motivo, desde un inicio hemos apoyado la realización de esta sesión especial que se ajusta al mandato de este órgano especializado de las Naciones Unidas. El conflicto en Sudán ha resultado en numerosos desafíos de derechos humanos, incluyendo violaciones y abusos del derecho a la vida, la libertad y la seguridad de las personas, así como los derechos a la educación, el acceso al agua y saneamiento, a la salud y al trabajo, entre otros. Las hostilidades han dificultado que las organizaciones humanitarias brinden asistencia y además han exacerbado la crisis de derechos humanos de las personas desplazadas internas y refugiados, afectando también también a los países vecinos. Las mujeres y los niños y niñas son particularmente vulnerables a la violencia sexual y de género durante los conflictos armados. En este caso, ha habido informes de violación y de niños reclutados por grupos armados y utilizados como niños soldados. Ante la gravedad de la situación en el terreno, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos tiene la responsabilidad ineludible de responder a los múltiples desafíos, entre ellos procurar una adecuada rendición de cuentas por las violaciones y abusos de derechos humanos cometidos por todas las partes del conflicto. La impunidad perpetúa el ciclo de violencia y dificulta que las víctimas obtengan justicia y reparación y que la sociedad no logre avanzar en procesos de reconciliación que garanticen la paz duradera. Costa Rica hace un llamado a todas las partes para que cesen de inmediato las hostilidades, respeten sus obligaciones de derecho internacional, de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario y cooperen con este Consejo, con la Corte Penal Internacional, los esfuerzos de la comunidad internacional, las organizaciones regionales y de la sociedad civil en favor de la rendición de cuentas, los derechos humanos y el Estado de Derecho. Gracias.
Thank you. And we continue with Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et salue la tenue de cette session extraordinaire. Nous exprimons notre pleine solidarité avec le peuple soudanais qui paye un lourd tribut depuis le 15 avril quand les forces armées du général Al-Burhan et les forces de soutien rapide du général Hamdan Dagalo d'Iemeti ont commencé à s'affronter. Le mépris des belligérants pour la sécurité de la population civile et pour le droit international humanitaire est flagrant. Ce mépris est une conséquence directe de longues années d'impunité. Comme l'a signalé notamment le haut-commissaire, les combats actuels sont le fruit d'un jeu de pouvoir dans l'intérêt personnel des deux généraux, qui font fi des aspirations démocratiques légitimes de la population. Ce Conseil s'était réuni en session extraordinaire en novembre 2021 pour répondre au coup d'État militaire qui avait été déclenché par ces deux mêmes hommes le mois précédent. À l'époque, ils avaient fait cause commune pour mettre fin à la transition démocratique qui avait suivi la révolution pacifique et populaire soudanaise. La situation humanitaire dans le pays est accablante, avec des centaines de milliers de déplacés et des centaines de civils tués. Ma délégation se joint aux appels exigeant que les deux parties au conflit cessent immédiatement et sans délai les hostilités et respectent pleinement leurs obligations sous le droit international des droits humains et le droit international humanitaire, notamment en matière de protection des civils. Ils doivent cesser également surtout l'utilisation d'armes explosives dans les zones densément peuplées. Les parties au conflit doivent permettre l'acheminement sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire. Nous appelons aussi à la protection des défenseurs des droits humains, surtout des femmes défenseuses des droits, qui ont été menacées spécifiquement pour leurs appels à la paix et à la redevabilité. C'est le moment de placer les intérêts de la population soudanaise au premier plan et de retourner sans tarder à la transition démocratique, tout en faisant toute la lumière sur les violations et abus des droits humains, afin d'en finir avec la culture d'impunité qui a engendré le présent conflit. Pour cette raison, le Luxembourg soutient la résolution devant nous, qui vise à renforcer le mandat de l'expert désigné et demande au haut-commissaire d'informer ce Conseil lorsque la situation au Soudan l'exige. Nous exhortons tous les membres du Conseil à en faire de même. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Now let me invite South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his candid yet grave statement on the human rights situation in Sudan. At the outset, allow me to express my delegation's solidarity with the people of Sudan, who have been subjected to unimaginable suffering since the outbreak of hostilities on 15 April 2023. The injuries, hurt, deprivation suffered, and the deaths of innocent civilians, including children, together with the untold damages that have been inflicted on the civilian infrastructure, is of grave concern. Indeed, the significant escalation in the conflict is serving to unleash a humanitarian catastrophe in a country which was already in a precarious humanitarian situation. This has in turn created a new wave of humanitarian challenges which are threatening to engulf the whole region. It is for this reason that South Africa joins those voices today which are urging the parties to the conflict to reach agreement on an unconditional and lasting ceasefire in order to address the dire humanitarian situation in the country. This ceasefire is an absolute and overriding priority, as it is fundamental to the establishment of humanitarian corridors necessary for unhindered humanitarian access and the evacuation of injured civilians. These corridors are also essential to addressing the rehabilitation of critical infrastructure, including water, electricity, and in ensuring civilians are able to have access to these services. South Africa therefore welcomes the talks that are currently taking place in Jeddah for this purpose, together with the ongoing regional efforts being deployed by IGAD under the auspices of the AU. These efforts will no doubt go a long way in securing the resumption of the political process through dialogue and negotiations towards the establishment of an inclusive, democratic, transitional civilian-led government which the people of Sudan have long yearned for. These regional efforts also underscore the importance of the application of the principle of complementarity and subsidiarity in ensuring that those who are directly affected by the conflict take the lead in determining its resolution. In this regard, it is important that the initiative that we undertake at the Council today serves to bolster the regional efforts to restore peace in Sudan, to resolve the conflict, as well as to stabilize the situation and silence the guns in the country. Even at this late hour, we urge this Council to speak with one voice on the situation that is unfolding.
And now let me invite Kyrgyzstan.
Is it all right? No? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kyrgyzstan hails the noble efforts of our brothers from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and those of the United States to restore peace and respect to human lives and human rights in Sudan. According to the reliable reports, the chances are high that today a ceasefire might be reached in Jeddah. That would allow the immediate delivery of emergency humanitarian assistance, which we believe is the most important immediate task. We believe that today's deliberations and the fact of the convening this session did already greatly contribute to the cause of reaching a ceasefire, which is crucial and indispensable for restoring respect to the human rights in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite Qatar.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بالبدء يضم وفد بلادي صوته للبيانات المقدمة من المجموعات التي ينتمي إليها. تؤكد دولة قطر حرصها على تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان بالسودان وعلى موقفها الثابت اتجاه وحدة وسلامة أراضيه، كما تجدد وقوفها إلى جانب الشعب السوداني في هذه الظروف التي يمر بها، والذي يستوجب تضافر جميع الجهود الوطنية والإقليمية والدولية لاستعادة الأمن والاستقرار في هذا البلد الشقيق. أن بلادي تراقب بقلق شديد تطورات النزاع الذي اندلع مؤخرا في السودان، وتدعو أطرافه إلى تحكيم صوت العقل وممارسة أقصى درجات ضبط النفس وتغليب المصلحة العامة وبذل كل ما في وسعهم لتجنيب المدنيين تبعات هذه الاقتتال. كما نشدد على أهمية أن تنتهج أطراف هذه الأزمة الحوار والطرق السلمية لتجاوز الخلافات، ونشيد في هذا الصدد بجميع الجهود الإقليمية والدولية التي تبذل حاليا لإنهاء هذه الأزمة، وعلى وجه الخصوص المحادثات التي تجري حاليا في مدينة جدة في إطار المبادرة السعودية الأمريكية، والتي تهدف للوصول إلى وقف شامل ودائم لإطلاق النار وتأمين وصول المساعدات الإنسانية للمتأثرين. ونثق بأن نجاح هذه المحادثات سيمهد الطريق نحو إيجاد تسوية سياسية حقيقية للأزمة السودانية، وستمكن الأطراف السودانية من الدخول في مفاوضات جادة وصولا لاتفاق شامل وسلام مستدام يحقق تطلعات الشعب السوداني الشقيق في الاستقرار والتنمية والازدهار. أننا ندعو مجلس حقوق الإنسان ومكتب المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان لتقديم ما يمكن من دعم فني في إطار الآليات القائمة لمساعدة الحكومة السودانية للوفاء بالتزاماتها في تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان. كما ندعو المجتمع الدولي لمواصلة جهوده في تقديم المساعدات الإنسانية العاجلة ودعم الشعب السوداني الشقيق لتعزيز صموده في مواجهة الظروف الصعبة التي يعيشها حاليا بسبب استمرار القتال. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. And now let me invite Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. From the outset, Eritrea believes bringing to an immediate end the present conflict in Sudan is an urgent necessity. In essence, the present conflict could be seen in relation to the undesirable trend followed by the political process of nation building introduced with the politicization of Islam after the advent of the NIF in power 3 decades ago. The popular movement of 2019, supported by the army, was intended to rectify and address the distortions created by NIF misrule. Hence, charting actions to the transitional phase to a new political dispensation should continue to the solemn and decisive task of the people of Sudan, who is able to resolve difficulties of higher magnitude. Regional efforts by IGAD aimed at complementing homegrown solutions are also welcome. While we acknowledge the need to respect for human rights, Eritrea vehemently opposes the continued meddling by some foreign countries and entities in the internal affairs of Sudan in the pretext of human rights. Thus, any initiative by the HRC should take the above stance in consideration and avoid politicization of human rights. Furthermore, the focus is made on addressing the root causes and solutions. It should be important to gear any follow-up on the protection of human rights in the prevailing crisis through the existing established mechanism of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last member speaking is Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of African states. Microphone, please, and start again.
Excusez-moi. Monsieur le Président, j'ai l'honneur de faire cette déclaration au nom du groupe africain. Le groupe africain suit de près la crise actuelle au Soudan. Nous exprimons notre solidarité au peuple soudanais en ce moment difficile. Nous sommes convaincus que l'instabilité où elle se trouve constitue une menace pour la paix, la sécurité, les droits de l'homme et le développement dans son ensemble. Le groupe africain regrette que le point de vue et les arguments du pays concerné relatifs à la tenue de la session extraordinaire n'aient pas reçu l'attention qu'ils méritaient de la part des États qui ont demandé la tenue de la session. Le groupe souligne qu'il convient de tenir dûment compte des principes de solidarité conformément au chapitre 6 de la Charte des Nations Unies et des solutions africaines aux problèmes africains. Le groupe salue donc les efforts de médiation régionale déployés par l'IGAD sous les auspices de l'Union africaine. Nous nous félicitons de tous les efforts complémentaires d'appui aux négociations déployées par les acteurs régionaux et internationaux et à ce titre, le Conseil, par ses actions, devrait renforcer les initiatives de paix de l'IGAD et de l'Union africaine. À ce stade, nous sommes d'avis que la priorité immédiate et absolue est de faire taire les armes et de faire parvenir un cessez-le-feu pour assurer l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire et l'assistance dont les populations ont tant besoin dans les zones touchées par le conflit et les négociations politiques entre toutes les parties. Nous nous félicitons des négociations entamées à Jeddah sous les auspices de l'Arabie Saoudite et des États-Unis en vue de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu afin de faciliter l'aide humanitaire. Le groupe souligne son attachement constant au respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'indépendance et l'unité politique de la République soudanaise, ainsi que l'importance du dialogue et la coopération dans le domaine de la promotion et de la protection des droits de l'homme et dans la réponse aux solutions d'urgence en matière de droits de l'homme. Nous exhortons la communauté internationale à fournir tous les appuis nécessaires au Soudan, y compris l'aide politique, économique, technique, développement et humanitaire, afin de permettre au pays de surmonter les défis de transition. Nous exhortons tous les partis soudanais à poursuivre le dialogue en vue d'une solution consensuelle à l'amiable à l'impasse politique au Soudan et a conduit le pays vers une transition pacifique et sans heurts vers la démocratie. Le groupe apprécie la coopération du gouvernement soudanais avec l'expert désigné du ACDH et l'ONU sur le Soudan et les autres à poursuivre cette coopération. Nous demandons instamment au ACDH de poursuivre son action technique au Soudan en fonction des besoins des exigences et la demande du pays concerné. Je vous remercie.
Monsieur. We will now continue with the list of speakers for observer states of the Council. The speaking time will be 1 minute and 30 seconds, and the first observer state on my list is Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein has been among the delegations that have supported the request for this special session, since we are concerned about the outbreak of hostilities on 15 April 2023 and its subsequent escalation of violence. In particular, we are concerned about reports of serious violations of international humanitarian law, including the numerous reports of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, attacks against humanitarian personnel and civilians, and looting and destruction of civilian or humanitarian property. The outbreak of hostilities has led to a significant rise of people in need of humanitarian assistance and hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the violence, putting additional strain on the region. It has also severely impacted the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, to food, and to health. We urge the parties to the conflict to lay down their weapons and to immediately return the country to its civilian-led government. It is our joint obligation to ensure accountability for violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and to support the Sudanese people in their plight for sustainable peace, democracy, and the full enjoyment of their human rights. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And let me invite Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia welcomes the special session on Sudan at this vital time for the Sudanese people. Australia condemns the ongoing violence between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, which has resulted in the needless deaths of hundreds and injury to many thousands. Reports of widespread human rights abuses and violations, including sexual and gender-based violence, are deeply troubling, as are attacks on diplomats, humanitarian officials and the premises of international organisations. We urge all parties to the conflict to uphold international humanitarian law and protect civilians. Sudan is heading for a humanitarian catastrophe. All parties must ensure urgent humanitarian support reaches those in need and afford all necessary protections to health and humanitarian workers as they seek to alleviate the widespread suffering. We commend the efforts of the international community in seeking to negotiate a permanent truce, including recent talks between the parties in Jeddah. Australia urges all parties to the conflict to permanently cease hostilities and to engage in meaningful negotiations. A negotiated solution, including a pathway to civilian rule, is the only way forward for the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm passing the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan is gravely concerned about the situation in Sudan that undermined the transition to civilian rule based on the constitutional declaration following the outbreak of hostilities and the significant escalation of violence across the country since 15th April. Japan is also deeply concerned about the worsening humanitarian situation and the calls for all actors to stop the violence immediately. Japan intends to proactively address the issue of Sudan, including through the engagement facilitated by its ambassador, Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. Furthermore, as Prime Minister Kishida stated during his visit to Africa last week, in order to respond to the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan and its neighboring countries, Japan stands ready to provide emergency humanitarian assistance to refugees in neighboring countries and to internally displaced persons in cooperation with the international organizations. Japan strongly hopes that long-term stability will be achieved in Sudan and the human rights will be protected. Japan, together with the G7 and other like-minded countries, intends to support Sudanese efforts toward the restoration of the transition to civilian rule in close cooperation with the region countries and other stakeholders. I thank you.
Thank you. Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Chair. The Republic of Korea is deeply concerned over the ongoing armed conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which has caused a devastating impact on the human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan. Since the outbreak of the hostilities, we have witnessed heavy fighting and airstrikes in populated areas, resulting in more than 500 deaths and forcing tens of thousands to flee. It is also troubling that a large number of civilians have been caught in the crossfire with limited access to food, water, and electricity. We call on all parties to immediately cease all hostilities and allow safe passage for civilians in compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law. My delegation is also troubled by the tragic humanitarian situation in Sudan. The fragile security condition and attacks against aid workers continue to hamper humanitarian operations, leaving millions of people without life-saving assistance. Unhindered humanitarian access and the safety of humanitarian workers must be fully ensured. In order to avert a further deterioration of the crisis, it is crucial for all parties to silence the guns and return to the negotiation table. With its full support for the ongoing mediation efforts, the Republic of Korea reaffirmed its steadfast commitment to restoring peace in Sudan and its democratic transition. I thank you.
Thank you. Monaco, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. La Principauté de Monaco condamne fermement les violations des droits de l'homme commises actuellement au Soudan et exprime sa solidarité au peuple soudanais. Depuis le 15 avril 2023, la situation sécuritaire se détériore de manière dramatique. L'escalade de violence à laquelle nous assistons a déjà causé la mort de centaines de personnes. Ces 3 dernières semaines, l'intensité des combats a conduit au déplacement de plusieurs centaines de milliers de civils, à la destruction des principales infrastructures, y compris de santé, et menace d'aggraver la sécurité alimentaire aiguë qui sévit déjà à large échelle dans le pays. À cet égard, la Principauté de Monaco en appelle au retour des conditions permettant un accès immédiat et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux populations touchées par ce conflit. Ma délégation demande également à toutes les parties impliquées de mettre fin aux violences et de rechercher une solution politique et négociée afin de renouer avec le processus de transition démocratique qui était engagé jusque-là. Compte tenu de la gravité de la situation, Monaco a soutenu la convocation de la présente session extraordinaire et a décidé de coparrainer la résolution soumise à l'examen du Conseil. Il nous semble en effet indispensable de renforcer le mandat de l'expert sur les droits de l'homme au Soudan et que le Conseil soit tenu informé régulièrement de l'évolution de la situation dans ce pays. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Bulgaria.
Mr. President, Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement and supports the convening of this special session for the following reasons. The outbreak of hostilities in the Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces and the escalation of violence across the country have led to the death of hundreds of civilians, thousands of injured, mass internal and external displacement, thus unfolding a human rights crisis and a dramatic deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Bulgaria condemns all reported abuses and violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law committed by all parties to the conflict and insists that further violations be immediately stopped. We appeal to all actors in the Sudan to take effective measures for the protection of civilians, foreign nationals, health and humanitarian workers, and of the staff of the UN and other international organizations, and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance and access to all those in need, with a focus on vulnerable groups such as IDPs, women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. Bulgaria urges all parties to the conflict in Sudan to immediately cease hostilities and engage in urgent talks to resolve the current crisis. We call on all parties in the Sudan to resume the political process aimed at appointing a transitional civilian government and holding elections at a later stage, and strongly support all regional and international efforts to that end. We believe that the promotion and the protection of human rights, the rule of law and accountability for all violations and crimes committed will be a solid foundation for a lasting solution to the current crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. And I'm passing the floor to the Holy See.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Holy See has been following with deep concern the developments of the grave situation of conflict and violence that has been unfolding in Sudan. As the suffering of the people and humanitarian needs increase, the Holy See wishes to assure once again its spiritual closeness, prayers, and solidarity with the Sudanese people, especially the displaced and the refugees. The Holy See is particularly concerned with the grave humanitarian and human rights implications of the conflict and urges all parties to suspend armed attacks and ensure access to basic and essential services for the civilian population wherever they are needed, which includes allowing the safe delivery of humanitarian assistance. In this regard, the Holy See hopes that the truce may be extended and be fully respected, and that the negotiations between the representatives of all parties in the conflict may result in a fruitful agreement for a ceasefire and for peaceful and durable solutions, in the interest of the Sudanese population, as well as to avoid the risk of the violence spread to neighboring countries, undermining regional peace and security. In conclusion, the Holy See remains confident that dialogue, in a spirit of fraternity, may bring about a just and lasting peace. This delegation wishes to echo the appeal and prayers of Pope Francis so that arms might be laid down and dialogue prevail in order to return together to the path of peace and harmony. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, today's special session would only be beneficial if the aspiration of Sudan as the country concerned were considered. Leading up to this meeting, we heard the position of Sudan. Indonesia echoes their concern and request for this Council to prioritize supporting ceasefire and humanitarian efforts. Ongoing violences must be stopped to protect civilians from further catastrophes. In this hour of need, Indonesia emphasizes the following. First, we call for relevant parties to immediately end the violence, declare an immediate ceasefire, and return to dialogue. Indonesia supports the ongoing effort by regional and other international actors. We emphasize that inclusive political dialogue is essential toward a democratic transition process. Second, we urge the international community to strengthen coordination and ensure adequate resources for humanitarian responses. The present authorities continue to ensure unimpeded and safe humanitarian corridor to deliver aid and evacuate civilians, prioritizing women and children and members of diplomatic mission. Third, we reiterate the importance to deliver technical assistance in response to Sudan needs and priorities. The Council should continuously provide capacity building in the field of human rights in support of an inclusive national reconciliation process. Indonesia stands ready to support the people of Sudan in their journey toward peace and prosperity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement, and we thank the core group for taking the initiative for this special session on Sudan. The Netherlands strongly supports the decision to enhance the mandate of the High Commissioner's designated expert. The Netherlands is gravely concerned by the use of violence by both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces against the civilians and healthcare workers. An estimated 70% of the hospitals in Khartoum are closed because of the targeted attacks and shortage of supplies. The Netherlands therefore strongly condemns these violations of international humanitarian law, preventing people from basic rights such as access to food, water and care. The ongoing abuses and violations need to be documented and the evidence collected preserved so that perpetrators on both sides can be held accountable for their crimes. We urge both the SAF and the RSF to end this conflict immediately and fully abide by ceasefire efforts. Mr. High Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, all efforts should be focused on ending these human rights and international humanitarian law violations and create safe corridors to provide humanitarian aid. The Netherlands is ready to support all efforts to obtain a solution and reaffirms its solidarity with the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. Brazil is the next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil is closely following the human rights situations in Sudan. We are very concerned about the unparalleled level of violence since the outbreak of the clashes on April 15th and its impacts on human rights. We commend the 7 neighboring countries of Sudan for keeping their borders open and receiving displaced persons. The attacks on civilian facilities, including hospitals and schools, and the looting of offices of civil society and international organizations, as well as diplomatic missions, are unacceptable. We reiterate our call for full respect by all parties to international humanitarian law and the Vienna Convention of 1961. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of hostilities that could allow unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance. We support the efforts of the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, the League of Arab States, the United Nations, and its Security Council in seeking lasting political solutions for the ongoing crisis, recalling the 2019 Constitutional Declaration and the Framework Agreement of 2022, we hope for the achievement of a political understanding leading to the return to a civilian-led government with full respect for human rights in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm inviting Peru.
Gracias, señor presidente. El Perú apoya la convocatoria a la presente sesión extraordinaria del Consejo que responde al deterioro creciente de los derechos humanos en Sudán a consecuencia del grave conflicto armado que aflige a dicha nación. Lamentamos profundamente la trágica pérdida de centenares de vidas, lo que ha incluido niñas, niños y jóvenes, así como reportes de agresiones sexuales contra mujeres sudanesas. El Perú coincide con lo señalado por el Alto Comisionado Voker Türk respecto al cese del fuego inmediato como una necesidad imperiosa y exhortamos a las partes involucradas en el conflicto a poner fin inmediatamente a las hostilidades y cumplir con el derecho internacional humanitario. Exhortamos a las partes de conflicto en Sudán a respetar los derechos humanos, proteger a la población civil, hacer cumplir el derecho a la justicia de todas y todos y garantizar la rendición de cuentas por las violaciones que se determinen se hayan cometido. Pedimos a la comunidad internacional a redoblar esfuerzos para apoyar el diálogo para lograr el cese de fuego, a fin de atender las demandas del pueblo sudanés por un futuro pacífico y democrático en el que se respete sus derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse soutient la tenue de cette session extraordinaire et l'élargissement du mandat de l'expert désigné par le haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme pour le Soudan. Elle est gravement préoccupée par les violents combats qui ont lieu au Soudan depuis le 15 avril dernier. Elle appelle les parties au conflit à un cessez-le-feu immédiat afin de permettre un accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave et à revenir sur la voie du dialogue. Mon pays est alarmé par les conséquences humanitaires désastreuses engendrées par le conflit qui a déjà coûté la vie à des centaines de civils et provoqué le déplacement forcé de dizaines de milliers de personnes. Il condamne les violations et atteintes des droits de l'homme et les violations du droit international humanitaire, notamment les attaques contre les hôpitaux. Il exhorte les parties au conflit à prendre toutes les mesures requises pour protéger la population civile. Le maintien de la connexion à Internet est également crucial pour que les personnes affectées puissent communiquer avec leurs proches et disposer d'informations fiables sur l'accès à des biens de première nécessité et sur des voies d'évacuation sûres. Finalement, la Suisse affirme son soutien aux efforts de médiation de la communauté internationale, en particulier des États voisins, des partenaires de la région, ainsi que de l'ONU, de l'Union africaine et de l'IGAD. Elle appelle les parties au conflit à coopérer pleinement avec ces acteurs en vue de mettre fin aux hostilités et d'œuvrer à une solution politique inclusive. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Uruguay.
Gracias, señor presidente. Uruguay sigue con preocupación el persistente deterioro de la situación en la República de Sudán, agravado en el contexto de los enfrentamientos entre las fuerzas de apoyo rápido y las fuerzas armadas, que profundizan un negativo panorama que también comprende la efectiva vigencia de los derechos humanos. Condenamos los ataques dirigidos contra la población y la infraestructura civil, expresando nuestra consternación por el crecimiento del número de muertes, heridos, personas obligadas a huir en un contexto de violencia y peligro, las dificultades para la asistencia humanitaria, así como las continuas denuncias de violencia física y sexual contra mujeres, niñas y niños. Ante esta situación, el Consejo debe reaccionar respondiendo dentro de sus competencias para contribuir a que no se produzcan nuevas víctimas. Bajo esta premisa, Uruguay ha copatrocinado la convocatoria de esta sesión especial. Asimismo, apoyamos el llamado del Alto Comisionado a poner inmediato fin a las hostilidades y al propio inicio de investigaciones. Alentamos a todas las partes involucradas a alcanzar una resolución de la presente crisis por medios pacíficos, garantizar el pleno respeto a los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario. Finalmente, los instamos a que cooperen con este Consejo, la oficina del Alto Comisionado y con el experto designado. Muchas gracias.
Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente. El Ecuador participa en esta sesión especial consternado por la violencia en Sudán y el recrudecimiento de las hostilidades desde el 15 de abril, provocando una crisis humanitaria de alarmantes proporciones. Deplora todas las acciones contrarias a los derechos humanos y al derecho internacional humanitario, entre ellas ataques contra trabajadores humanitarios e infraestructura civil, en particular hospitales y aeropuertos. Igualmente deplora la pérdida de cientos de vidas, incluyendo mujeres y niños, en el contexto del enfrentamiento entre las Fuerzas Armadas sudanesas y las Fuerzas de Apoyo Rápido, así como el aumento de la violencia sexual y de género. El Ecuador insta a que se respeten los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario, se establezcan corredores que permitan la evacuación de civiles y se garantice la seguridad del personal humanitario. Igualmente, resulta crucial abordar la crítica situación de los desplazados internos de Darfur, así como la de las mujeres y niñas que huyen de la violencia. Ecuador se suma al llamado para que las partes en conflicto cesen inmediatamente las hostilidades y reanuden el diálogo para resolver la crisis en Sudán y en el marco del respeto de los derechos humanos y los principios democráticos. Finalmente, considera de vital importancia apoyar los esfuerzos regionales e internacionales para devolver al país al proceso de transición hacia un orden constitucional. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And now let me invite Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. The gravity, scale and the complexity of current crisis in Sudan is manifested in a high level of civilian casualties, displacement, destruction, migration and suffering of the most vulnerable parts of the population, including women and children. Croatia strongly condemns the ongoing military attacks motivated by the struggle for power. We call upon all actors in Sudan to ensure protection of civilians, including against sexual and gender-based violence. We call upon all parties to the conflict to immediately stop the hostilities and refrain from further violations and abuses of human rights and to cease the violations of international humanitarian law. We emphasize the important role of the civil society whose peaceful struggle and sacrifice for democracy should get more prominence at the international support. Mr. President, it is imperative to ensure ceasefire, humanitarian access and corridors for the evacuation of civilians. We call upon Sudan to ensure meaningful domestic accountability for all violations and abuses. Sudan is of crucial importance for the stability of the entire Northeast Africa. The lives of millions are at stake. The worst is yet to come, it seems, and we should do our utmost to prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. You have the floor.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela expresa su preocupación por el conflicto en Sudán y lamenta profundamente la pérdida de vidas y la delicada situación humanitaria generada. La convocatoria a esta sesión especial y la resolución promovida por sus patrocinadores no cuentan con el consentimiento del país concernido sobre la base del desconocimiento de las iniciativas regionales actualmente en curso, impulsadas para alcanzar un necesario cese al fuego y avanzar hacia la paz. Resulta prudente apoyar los esfuerzos de la Liga Árabe y la Unión Africana en el abordaje de la situación con el concurso del país concernido. Venezuela estima necesario respaldar estas importantes gestiones que deben propender a una efectiva protección y promoción de los derechos humanos. Una vez más, apelamos a nuestra diplomacia bolivariana de paz, llamando a cesar toda acción que conduzca a una escalada. Mi país, firme defensor de los propósitos y principios de la Carta, alienta a retomar el camino del diálogo entre las partes en aras de preservar la vida, los derechos humanos y la necesaria estabilidad del país y la región. Reiteramos nuestro firme compromiso con los valores supremos de la paz, la amistad y la solidaridad entre las naciones del mundo. Seguiremos alentando a la solución pacífica de las controversias con base a los principios universales del respeto a la soberanía y la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los Estados consagrados en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Malta expresses deep concern regarding the current human rights situation in Sudan. We deeply regret that much of the fighting has been concentrated in heavily populated parts of Khartoum and residential areas elsewhere in the country, which has exposed civilians to death and injury. We also regret the intense clashes in several states in Darfur that resulted in considerable fatalities, injuries and heavy infrastructural damage. We are also concerned with the ensuing precarious humanitarian situation experienced by those trapped and displaced by the fighting, who are unable to access basic services, medical care, food and water. We call on both parties to the conflict to ensure respect for their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructures such as schools and hospitals. Furthermore, we are appalled by the reports of sexual and gender-based violence and call on both parties to the conflict to take all necessary measures to take preventive measures. Malta urges thorough and independent investigations into reported violations and for those responsible to be held accountable. Finally, we call on all parties to de-escalate tensions and to put shared interest of the Sudanese people first. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And we continue with Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus aligns itself with the statement by the European Union. Since the outbreak of hostilities, the human rights and the humanitarian situation in Sudan has rapidly deteriorated, especially impacting women and girls. We urge all parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities and to fully respect their obligations under international law. There is an urgent need to provide immediate humanitarian assistance to the people of Sudan. The deliberate denial and obstruction of humanitarian access is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Cyprus supports regional and international efforts to implement a lasting and sustainable ceasefire agreement, and we welcome all mediation efforts towards this end. Furthermore, the efforts by neighbouring states that have kept their borders open and are assisting refugees must not go unnoticed. Beyond the imperative of a lasting ceasefire, a national reconciliation process and the formation of an inclusive government, promoting accountability and paving the way for the democratic transition of Sudan is an integral part of the overall solution. During evacuation efforts from Sudan, undertaken recently, Cyprus was a safe transit hub, and we shall continue to contribute whenever needed by the international community in humanitarian evacuation efforts. I thank you.
Thank you. And I'm inviting Ethiopia.
Mr. President, Ethiopia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the representative of Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of the African group and would like to make the following remarks. Ethiopia, as a neighboring country, is gravely concerned over the ongoing fighting and appeals to both parties of the conflict to stop the fighting and allow humanitarian relief and assistance to the people that are in need. Ethiopia underscores that there can only be a political solution to the crisis and advocates for its resolution on the basis of the principle of African solutions to African problems. In this regard, Ethiopia's recent peace agreement to resolve the conflict in the northern part of the country can serve as a useful example. Accordingly, we stress on the importance of giving priority to existing regional and continental mechanisms to resolve the crisis, namely the efforts of IGAD under the auspices of the African Union. Proliferation of initiatives and mandates is counterproductive. In this connection, we find this special session to be untimely. Any new mechanism to be successful should be owned by the Sudanese themselves and be based on the consent of the concerned country on the basis of the principle of complementarity. We emphasize on the respect of Sudan's national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Finally, we wish to express our solidarity with the brotherly people of Sudan at this difficult time. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. We are deeply concerned by the devastating consequences of this latest phase of conflict in a country already facing severe human rights, humanitarian and economic challenges as a result of the military coup of October 2021. Ireland condemns all attacks on local and international humanitarian personnel and humanitarian assets, the targeting of health workers, lawyers, journalists, community organisers and human rights defenders, as well as reprisals against civilians who urge an end to the war or refuse to support attainment of military objectives must end. Their work is critical to both the immediate and long-term protection of human rights in Sudan. We urge the parties to facilitate immediate and unconditional humanitarian access and protection in line with obligations under international law. With fighting concentrated in urban areas and use of explosive and aerial weaponry, IDP settlements, hospitals, schools and vital civilian infrastructure have all been the target of attack. UNICEF reports that 7 children are killed or injured each hour. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced. The work of OHCHR and the designated expert are vital to both preventing and ensuring accountability for human rights violations. Ireland supports the strengthening of monitoring and reporting. We call on this Council to speak with a united voice against this reckless violence and in solidarity with the Sudanese people in their demands for a peaceful and democratic future. I thank you.
Thank you. Italy.
Mr. President, Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Italy is deeply concerned about the deterioration of the human rights situation in Sudan following the outbreak of hostilities on 15 April, which have already caused a death toll of hundreds and thousands of injured. We are also gravely concerned about the exacerbation of the already dire humanitarian situation in the country, as well as the sharp increase of internally displaced persons and refugees in neighboring countries. Italy calls on all actors involved to immediately end the armed confrontations, protect civilians, and refrain from attacks on civilian infrastructures, including medical and education facilities, as well to enable rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Italy welcomes and supports all mediation efforts, including by the UN, the African Union, IGAD, and the League of Arab States, to achieve a lasting ceasefire and resume an inclusive political dialogue with a view to establishing a transitional civilian government. We also appreciate the joint initiative by the US and Saudi Arabia that led to preliminary talks in Jeddah between representatives of the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Italy stands in solidarity with the people of Sudan, whose aspirations for a peaceful and democratic future deserve the full support of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel is concerned over the recent events in Sudan and the implications of the ongoing hostilities which began on 15 April 2023. Israel calls on all parties to show restraint and to refrain from attacks on the civilian population. In addition, Israel calls on all parties to return to the path of internal reconciliation in order to conclude the process of governmental transition with a wide consensus. Mr. President, since fighting erupted in the country, Israel has been operating via various channels to reach a permanent ceasefire and welcomes several ceasefire agreements reached in the last few weeks. Israel urges all parties to respect them and reach a peaceful solution. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite New Zealand.
Mr. President, New Zealand is deeply concerned by the alarming human rights situation in Sudan. The many hundreds killed, thousands wounded, and hundreds of thousands displaced are a grim testimony to the toll the conflict has already taken on the people of Sudan. But these numbers tell only part of the story. The destruction wrought by the fighting has thrown the population into a humanitarian crisis, stands in the way of Sudan's transition to democracy, and imperils the human rights of the Sudanese people. New Zealand urges the parties to the conflict to negotiate and adhere to a ceasefire to alleviate human suffering, particularly by allowing access for humanitarian aid and with a view to agreeing a long-term negotiated peaceful settlement enabling the transition to civilian-led government. Mr. President, reports of human rights violations and abuses by the combatants to the conflict, including reports of sexual and gender-based violence, are deeply disturbing. It is therefore entirely appropriate that the Human Rights Council is holding this special session. New Zealand supports the resolution, which enhances the existing mandate of the High Commissioner's designated expert on human rights in the Sudan and is complementary to other international and regional efforts towards peace in Sudan. We urge all Council members to support its adoption. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite Egypt.
السيد الرئيس، ينضم وفد بلادي لبياني المجموعتين العربية والأفريقية، وبصفتنا الوطنية نود الإعراب عن تضامن مصر مع الشعب السوداني الشقيق الذي ترتبط معه بعلاقات تاريخية كدولة جوار مباشر، وتحرص مصر على استقرار الأوضاع السياسية والأمنية وسرعة تلبية الاحتياجات الإنسانية في السودان، ومن ثم نؤكد على ضرورة الوقف الفوري والشامل لإطلاق النار حفاظا على مقدرات الشعب السوداني الشقيق ومؤسسات الدولة السودانية. إن مصر تبذل جهودا مضنية للعمل على تسهيل عبور الوافدين من السودان من المعابر الحدودية وتوفير المساعدات الإنسانية والخدمات الطبية اللازمة لهم، ونحث كافة المنظمات الدولية والوكالات الأممية في المجال الإنساني على مضاعفة جهودها وتوفير المساعدات اللازمة لتخفيف معاناة الشعب السوداني. وننتهز الفرصة لنؤكد موقفنا المبدئي الرافض لعقد جلسات المجلس حول أوضاع حقوق حقوق الإنسان في الدول أو إنشاء آليات لمتابعة الأوضاع فيها أو التوسع في الآليات القائمة بالفعل دون موافقة الدولة المعنية، لا سيما إذا كانت تلك الدولة متعاونة بالفعل مع المجلس وآلياته المختلفة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank you, and I'm inviting Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement. We are deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Sudan. For decades, Sudan has provided shelter for internally displaced persons as well as for refugees from the region. Despite conflicts in some parts of the country, a significant part remained peaceful. Following the outbreak of hostilities since 15 April 2023, many civilians have been killed, injured or displaced. Civilian infrastructure has been destroyed. The ongoing fighting between the Sudanese armed force and the rapid support forces threatens the safety and security of people of Sudan and undermines the transition towards a civilian-led transitional government. We condemn any attacks on humanitarian workers and civil society organizations and call on all parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We call on parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities without preconditions and to work on a political solution to end the ongoing conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. Iraq is the next.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يضم العراق صوته إلى بيان المجموعة العربية وبيانات المجموعات السياسية والإقليمية التي ينتمي لها، ويود أن يتقدم بالتعازي لضحايا الأوضاع الأخيرة في السودان، ويعرب عن موقفه الداعم لحكومة وشعب السودان الشقيق. السيد الرئيس، يؤكد العراق على موقفه الداعي إلى ضرورة وقف إطلاق النار بشكل فوري والسماح بوصول المساعدات الإنسانية، ويشيد بالمبادرات العربية الرامية إلى دفع طرفي النزاع في السودان إلى وقف إطلاق النار والبدء بالحوار باعتباره الحل الوحيد للخروج من هذه الأزمة الخطيرة، والابتعاد عن التصعيد حفاظا على السلم الأهلي وخدمة لمصالح الشعب السوداني الشقيق. ختاما، يؤكد العراق موقفه الداعم لوحدة الأراضي السودانية وسلامتها ومنع جميع التدخلات الخارجية التي من شأنها أن تخل بأمن المنطقة وتزعزع استقرارها ونبذ العنف وتعريض أرواح الأبرياء إلى القتل. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite Zimbabwe.
With the Africa Group statement, like others who have spoken before us, we express our full solidarity with the people of Sudan at this extremely challenging time. We deplore the loss of life and the wanton destruction of critical infrastructure. Our collective priority, Mr. President, must be to end the fighting and to ensure secure pathways for the immediate delivery of humanitarian assistance. With regard to ongoing mediation efforts, we stress that due regard should be given to the principle of subsidiarity, and in this regard, we are fully supportive of regional mediation efforts by IGAD, the League of Arab States, supported by the African Union, prioritizing human life, the primacy of a ceasefire, and the restoration of lasting peace in Sudan. We welcome ongoing negotiations in Jeddah in this direction. We call for the mobilization of urgent humanitarian assistance, especially for the internally displaced, for refugees, and indeed for all vulnerable groups. With regard to the resolution before us, Mr. President, we reiterate our concern at the multiplicity of human rights initiatives and the continued resort to country-specific resolutions without the consent of the country concerned. Ignoring or overriding the position of the country concerned, already deeply engaged with existing HR mandates and mechanisms, may prove unhelpful and may actually serve to undermine the effectiveness of this Council in the fulfillment of its mandate. I thank you, sir.
I thank you. And now let me invite Saudi Arabia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. إن جمهورية السودان وشعبها الشقيق تمر بأزمة غير مسبوقة، وخيارنا في المملكة العربية السعودية هو بالوقوف إلى جانبها ودعمها للوصول بها إلى بر الأمان، والأولوية في هذه المرحلة إلى التهدئة وضبط النفس وتغليب لغة الحوار وصوت الحكمة والانخراط في حوار سلمي بهدف إعادة الاستقرار السياسي للسودان وشعبه. سيد الرئيس، إن المملكة استضافت طرفي النزاع في مباحثات أولية في مدينة جدة، وما زالت المباحثات مستمرة، وذلك بدءا من 6 مايو 2023. كما أن الاستضافة هي نتاج تكاتف دولي وجهود حثيثة مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبالشراكة مع دول المجموعة الرباعية والشركاء من الآلية الثلاثية، وتهدف هذه الاستضافة للوصول إلى هدنة ووقف إطلاق نار وتسهيل وصول المساعدات الإنسانية. كما ترحب المملكة في ذات السياق بكافة المبادرات الإقليمية التي تهدف لإنهاء الأزمة والتوصل لاتفاق وإعادة الأمن والاستقرار في السودان. وترى المملكة أنه المسار الأمثل والأنجع عوضا عن اتخاذ مسارات أو خطوات تعقد المشهد. سيد الرئيس، تؤكد بلادي على ضرورة الاستجابة للوضع الإنساني في السودان، ومن ذلك حماية العمليات الإنسانية وتوفير الممرات الآمنة للعاملين في المجال الإنساني وتيسير وتأمين عمليات الإجلاء للمدنيين. وفي هذا الشأن أجلت المملكة حوالي 8498 شخصا ينتمون ل 110 جنسية، ووجهت القيادة الكريمة حفظها الله بتقديم مساعدات إنسانية متنوعة.
Iran, you have the floor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates its fundamental position on the necessity of respecting national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in internal affairs of countries as the important principles of international law, which should be taken into account in fulfilling the mandate of the Human Rights Council. We believe strongly that the excessive use of holding special session against developing countries undermine the provisions of the Resolution 60/20 and 2051, which emphasizes on the principle of non-selectivity, objectivity, and impartiality, as well as on the genuine dialogue and cooperation as the main basis of promotion and protection of human rights, and strengthening the capacity of member states to comply with their human rights obligations. Human rights issues and the Council should not be instrumentalized as a tool of some powers for advancing their political agenda and means of pressure on states and manipulating their internal developments. It's regretful that in this case, some foreign parties seek to play a destructive role by inciting and intensifying the crisis. Holding this special session is part of these negative interventions and will not bring any achievement for parties and people of Sudan. We re-emphasize that the only solution is a Sudanese dialogue based on internal initiatives. Bearing this in mind, we call on internal parties to stop immediately the military confrontation and look forward a peaceful solution through dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and I'm inviting Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, внимательно следим за развитием ситуации в Судане. Отмечаем ухудшение гуманитарной обстановки, нехватку продовольствия и медикаментов во многих регионах страны. Призываем стороны конфликта проявить политическую волю и предпринять незамедлительные шаги для прекращения огня. Исходим из того, что любые разногласия могут быть урегулированы только за столом переговоров. После прекращения вооруженного противостояния необходимо осуществить практические шаги для возобновления межсуданского диалога. В целях придания ему инклюзивного характера считаем важным вовлечь в этот процесс все влиятельные политические силы и этноконфессиональные группы Судана, в том числе авторитетных региональных лидеров. Исходим из того, что продвижение на этом направлении будет способствовать достижению широкого общенационального согласия. Вместе с тем, Россия неизменно выступает против политизации суданского сюжета в СПЧ. Раскручивание этой темы в Совете контрпродуктивно и по факту не способствует урегулированию кризиса в стране. Навязывание извне суданскому руководству весьма сомнительных социально-экономических схем и универсальных демократизаторских шаблонов, а также политизация вопросов, связанных с предоставлением экономической и финансовой помощи, неприемлемы. Убеждены, что народ Судана способен и должен самостоятельно решать внутренние проблемы. Международное же сообщество, включая СПЧ, должно оказывать ему в этом посильное содействие. Благодарю за внимание.
Now let me invite Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, as part of the core group, Norway welcomes this special session. And as others here today, we strongly condemn the ongoing violence and urge the combatants to agree and adhere to a ceasefire immediately. The fighting must stop now. The situation for the civilian population is catastrophic, with enormous humanitarian needs and grave human rights violations. Women and children are again likely to pay the heaviest price. We therefore call on the parties to urgently take measures to fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and protect all civilians, including children and humanitarian and health workers. The parties must allow and facilitate safe, unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance without delay. Norway supports all efforts aimed at de-escalating, resolving the situation and responding to humanitarian needs. We stand firmly behind the efforts of the Sudanese people to establish a democratic and peaceful future. There needs to be a resumption of the political process through dialogue and negotiations towards the establishment of an inclusive, democratic, transitional, civilian-led government. I thank you.
Thank you. And let me invite Libya.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تضم بلادي صوتها إلى بيانات.
Thank you, President.
تضم بلادي صوتها إلى بياني المجموعة العربية والمجموعة الأفريقية، ونجدد تضامننا مع دولة السودان الشقيق وشعبه وفي هذا الظرف الصعب الذي تمر به، ونؤكد على ضرورة الحفاظ على استقلال ووحدة وسلامة أراضيه، ونشدد على الأهمية القصوى للعمل على وقف إطلاق النار وتيسير وصول المساعدات الإنسانية بما يخفف من معاناة المدنيين، كما نعرب عن تأييدنا لكافة الجهود الإقليمية الرامية إلى وقف إطلاق النار والعودة إلى المسار السياسي بما يمهد الطريق لتحقيق الاستقرار والانتقال الديمقراطي، وعلى رأسها المبادرة السعودية الأمريكية والحوار الذي تشهده مدينة جدة حاليا. سيد الرئيس، نؤكد على دعمنا لدولة السودان الشقيق وعلى ضرورة احترام وجهة نظر الدولة المعنية وما عبرت عنه من شواغر تجاه عقد هذه الجلسة الخاصة وما قد ينتج عنها من آليات جديدة أو توسيع للآليات القائمة، خاصة في ظل وجود عدد من الآليات الدولية لمتابعة حالة حقوق الإنسان في السودان، وهو ما قد يربك ويعقد عمل هذه الآليات ويحد من فاعليتها. وختاما ندعو المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان لمواصلة تقديم الدعم الفني والتقني لدولة السودان بما يمكنه من تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Delegation of Chad. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation du Tchad souscrit à la déclaration prononcée par le groupe africain. Pays voisin, le Tchad voudrait dire toute sa solidarité avec le Soudan dans cette terrible épreuve. Monsieur le Président, le secrétaire général des Nations Unies avait alerté que la crise ne s'étende pas au-delà des frontières du Soudan et qu'elle ne vienne pas à menacer les transitions démocratiques et les processus de paix en cours dans les pays voisins. Nous saluons cette prise de position. Réaffirmant notre attachement au principe de la subsidiarité, notre pays n'est pas favorable à toute initiative parallèle unilatérale qui pourrait gêner les initiatives déjà en cours. Aussi, le Tchad voudrait rappeler que la situation des droits de l'homme, du reste préoccupante, au Soudan est déjà inscrite à l'ordre du jour de la 53e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme prévue pour le mois de juin prochain. Par conséquent, le Tchad estime que la priorité devrait être accordée à l'obtention d'un cessez-le-feu qui puisse permettre le déploiement de l'assistance humanitaire et freiner le déplacement massif des populations qui impactent sur le voisinage immédiat. Toutes nos prières vont à l'endroit de nos frères et sœurs du Soudan. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Je passe la parole au Niger.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Niger fait sienne la déclaration faite par la Côte d'Ivoire au nom du groupe africain et souhaite apporter les éléments suivants en sa capacité nationale. Le Niger réaffirme son attachement ferme aux droits de l'homme et son opposition à toute atteinte à ses attributs sacrés de la personne humaine. Toutefois, dans le cas d'espèce, nous doutons beaucoup de l'efficacité d'une session spéciale du Conseil des droits de l'homme pour faire face à la situation actuelle du Soudan. Ma délégation craint particulièrement de voir la dite session agir négativement sur les processus en cours visant le retour de la paix ainsi que les efforts de coopération du Soudan avec les mécanismes de droits de l'homme déjà existants, condition indispensable à la gestion efficace de la situation humanitaire créée et surtout à une meilleure protection des droits de l'homme. Ma délégation relève également un manque de consultation préalable et transparente avec le groupe africain dont elle assure la présidence et dont elle en aurait été le témoin privilégié. Enfin, le Niger réitère son soutien aux initiatives menées par l'autorité intergouvernementale pour le développement et l'Union africaine, ainsi qu'au processus de JEDA conduit par l'Arabie saoudite et les États-Unis, entre autres, pour aider le Soudan à sortir de cette situation et invite le reste de la communauté internationale à plutôt concourir à l'obtention d'un cessez-le-feu durable, au déploiement de l'aide humanitaire et à l'ouverture d'un dialogue entre les deux parties.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Кризисная ситуация в Судане требует скорейшего урегулирования конфликта в целях прекращения насилия, восстановления порядка, обеспечения безопасности гражданского населения. Суданская делегация высказала свою позицию по вопросу проведения специальной сессии. Игнорирование этой позиции свидетельствует о продолжении в Совете практики навязывания политически мотивированных решений, вопреки воле затрагиваемых суверенных государств. Призываем Совет воздерживаться от действий, которые могут оказать негативное влияние на переговорный процесс и затормозить скорейшее урегулирование ситуации в Судане. Выступаем за восстановление внутрисуданского диалога и стабильности в этой стране, а также скорейшее разрешение гуманитарных проблем. Благодарю вас.
Nigeria, you are the next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nigeria aligns with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group and that of the government of Sudan to oppose the convening of a special session by this council on the human rights situation in Sudan. We strongly condemn the wanton violence and killing of innocent civilians, including children. However, the call for this special session is a flagrant disregard of the sovereignty and political independence of Sudan, and indeed an outright dismissal of the efforts and commitment of the African Union, IGAD, UN Security Council, and other regional mediation efforts to ensure a lasting ceasefire. It is pertinent to highlight that the very decision by some member states to convene this special session without recourse to ongoing continental efforts is obstructive. We have the view that actions such as these only undermine continental mediation efforts, including the robust engagement of Saudi Arabia and UAE. The delegation of Nigeria remains resolute that regardless of the alliances or nomenclature, any attempt to interfere in the internal politics of Sudan through the creation of another human rights mandate or mechanism is counterproductive and should neither be encouraged nor find room within this council. While recalling the principles of complementarity and subsidiarity, we urge the Human Rights Council to support the government of Sudan in its effort to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict by opposing any decision on actions that could complicate the already tense situation in the country. We therefore call on member states of this esteemed council to support the ongoing efforts to return Sudan to a transition process and constitutional order and to ensure unfettered access to humanitarian assistance and relief. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me give the floor to Turkey.
Mr. President, we follow the ongoing clashes with deep concern. International community cannot let the clashes turn into a protracted conflict with severe consequences for the people of Sudan and across the borders. The Turkish authorities are in close contact with all sides for urgent ceasefire and dialogue. We welcome the start of pre-negotiation talks in Jeddah. We support the efforts of the African Union and IGAD in this process. Return to the civilian rule in Sudan is the ultimate goal. Therefore, we appreciate the role played by the African Union, together with UNITAMS and IGAD, towards the civilian-led government. We support the calls in the resolution to the parties for a permanent ceasefire and negotiations. At the same time, we endorse the principles of African solutions for African problems. With this understanding, we are ready to contribute to the efforts the African Union and other regional organizations such as IGAD. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me invite Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. 3.5 weeks after fighting broke out between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces, bringing fear, deprivation, trauma and suffering to civilians, the human rights situation in Sudan continues to deteriorate dramatically. Austria notes with great concern the escalating violence and attacks on civilians, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence in Sudan. Women and girls are the primary victims of these atrocities, with reports of rape, sexual assault, and harassment. In addition, restrictions on freedom of expression, media, and access to information in Sudan are of grave concern. Journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists face threats, intimidation, and censorship that prevent them from carrying out their important work. Austria fully supports the draft resolution before us, particularly strengthening the designated expert on Sudan, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and OHCHR. We call on all parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities and fighting, to protect civilians, and to fully comply with and negotiate a durable ceasefire, and to respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Thank you. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada remains deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian and human rights situation in Sudan and calls for an immediate end to the violence. We are not only preoccupied with what is happening in urban centers, but also with what this will mean for already delicate regions like Darfur. Millions of people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Hospitals and doctors are being targeted, and attacks on communication infrastructure are unacceptable. Canada is also concerned by the increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence, particularly for women, human rights defenders, and women and children seeking to leave. Mr. President, the Council has a distinct and complementary role to play in response to the crisis, one that is coordinated with and reinforces regional efforts to support the establishment of a transitional and civilian-led government. We welcome the draft resolution, in particular its proposal to provide additional resources for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to respond to the situation. There can be no enduring peace and security in Sudan without respect for all human rights. Any settlement must ensure that the voices of local civil society are heard and integrated, including political groups, peace builders, and a vibrant press. Canada will continue to support the people of Sudan in their call for a return to a peaceful and civilian-led transition and their aspirations for freedom, peace, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next on my list is Mauritania.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation souscrit aux déclarations faites au nom des groupes arabes et africains et réaffirme son attachement à la souveraineté, l'indépendance, l'unité et l'intégrité territoriale du Soudan et réitère son soutien ferme au peuple soudanais dans les circonstances difficiles qu'il traverse actuellement. Nous suivons avec une vive préoccupation la situation qui prévaut au Soudan, la grave escalade sécuritaire qui la caractérise et ses conséquences désastreuses sur la vie des citoyens et la stabilité du pays. Nous appelons toutes les parties soudanaises concernées à faire preuve de retenue, à privilégier le dialogue et à tenir compte de l'intérêt supérieur du peuple soudanais. Nous sommes d'avis que la priorité doit être accordée à la promotion du dialogue en vue de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu et de faire face à la situation humanitaire dramatique sur le terrain. À cet égard, nous saluons l'ouverture des pourparlers sur la trêve humanitaire à Jeddah sous l'égide du Royaume frère d'Arabie Saoudite et des États-Unis d'Amérique, ainsi que les médiations régionales menées par l'IGAD et soutenues par l'Union africaine. Aussi, pensons-nous que la convocation d'une session spéciale du Conseil des droits de l'homme pourrait s'avérer superfétatoire, voire contrarier les efforts en cours. En conclusion, ma délégation appelle la communauté internationale à apporter une aide d'urgence au Soudan pour lui permettre de supporter les difficultés actuelles et à appuyer le processus de médiation en cours pour parvenir à une solution définitive de cette crise qui sera nécessairement politique. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. South Sudan, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of South Sudan has taken note of the report on the current crisis in Sudan and aligns itself with the statement of the African Group. We have been closely monitoring the situation of the ongoing crisis in the sisterly country, Sudan. Mr. President, despite the challenges Sudan going through, and in line with the principles of solutions to the problems in Africa, South Sudan believes that African solutions remain better options to African problems. And given the historical ties between Sudan and South Sudan, we have been working closely to foster and mediate peaceful political settlements with each other countries. South Sudan supports the IGAD initiative, whereby the IGAD heads of its state and government delegated on 16th of April 2023 His Excellency President Salva Kiir Mayardit and his Kenyan and Djibouti counterparts to consult with Sudanese leaders on the urgency of arresting the current situation in the sisterly country Sudan. Mr. President, in light of the political initiative of IGAD supported by the African Group and the ongoing negotiations started in Jeddah under the auspices of Saudi Arabia and United States of America, South Sudan calls on the Human Rights Council to consider lifting the unjustified imposed human rights resolutions on Sudan.
Thank you. And we will continue with Tanzania. Tanzania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. The United Republic of Tanzania aligns itself with the statement made by Cote d'Ivoire on behalf of the African Group. We join hands in expressing our solidarity with the Sudan and commend the ongoing mediation by the region to ensure that an amicable solution is reached and peace prevails. We further encourage the international community to complement the efforts by Sudan to protect and promote human rights and provide the needed humanitarian assistance. We also encourage continued cooperation between Sudan and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other UN agencies. I thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity.
I thank you, and I'm inviting Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تتابع تونس بانشغال تطورات الأحداث الجارية بالسودان الشقيق وتعرب عن قلقها البالغ اللي آلت إليه الأوضاع الأمنية وتأثيراتها على العملية السياسية بهذا البلد. تجدد تونس التعبير عن تضامنها التام مع الشعب السوداني والسودان في هذه المرحلة الدقيقة. وتدعو جميع الأطراف السودانية لخفض التصعيد وتغليب صوت الحكمة وانتهاج الحوار سبيل لنزع فتح الأزمة في فتيل الأزمة ولتحقيق التوافق السياسي حفاظا على استقرار السودان والصول لمقدرات شعبه الشقيق. وتشيد تونس بالجهود الدولية والإقليمية الرامية لإنهاء الصراع وترحب ببدء المباحثات بمدينة جدة من أجل التوصل لوقف إطلاق النار الذي يعد الأولوية المطلقة في هذه المرحلة.
regional levels and the negotiations in Jeddah so as to give top priority to a ceasefire and resume the political process
وحدته وسلامته
Sudanese ownership
وعدم
of that
التدخل في
process.
شؤونه الداخلية والعمل على تجنب مزيد تأجيج الصراع وتهديد السلم والأمن الإقليميين. كما تنوه تونس بتعاون السودان مع المفوضية السامية وآليات حقوق
We also
الإنسان.
pay tribute to Sudan's cooperation with the Council. Thank you, President.
Thank you. And the last observer state on my list is Uganda. Uganda, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Uganda aligns with the African Group statement. As a country in the region, Uganda has continued to follow the unfortunate events in the Sudan with keen interest both at a regional and a bilateral level. We remain concerned of the deteriorating situation in the country, in particular the loss of life and destruction of property. This situation is not only creating a humanitarian crisis, but also has far-reaching implications for regional peace and security. Chair, the IGAD region has taken necessary steps to address the current situation. The leaders have agreed on a mechanism of engagement with the Sudan leadership, and we urge the international community to support the regional efforts to realize peace, security, and stability in the Sudan. We wish to echo the call by IGAD for an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, de-escalate tensions, and allow unfettered humanitarian access. The most critical issue to date, in our view, is an immediate cessation of hostilities. Whereas the Council is rightfully concerned with the human rights situation in the Sudan, the question that begs is how this specific session will realize its purpose without an immediate end to the fighting. Therefore, it is essential that this Council works cooperatively with the Sudan as a country of concern to successfully achieve the tenets of the resolution under consideration today. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I recognize the request for the floor from the Equatorial Guinea. Sir, You have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. La delegación de Guinea Ecuatorial se suma a la declaración del grupo africano. Guinea Ecuatorial se siente profundamente preocupado por el conflicto.
You are not on the list of speakers. You didn't actually register yourself to the list of speakers, so I gave you floor because you waved your flag. I announce 15 minutes after the beginning of the session that the list of speakers is closed, and you are not on the list of speakers. So I don't know what you're asking for.
Intervención. Había solicitado. Como ya había solicitado, pido perdón si me puedes permitir intervenir.
So let me ask the Council if there are any objections to that. I don't see any objections, so you have the floor, sir.
Gracias, señor presidente, por la interrupción. La delegación de Guinea Ecuatorial se suma a la declaración del grupo africano. Guinea Ecuatorial se siente profundamente preocupado por el conflicto del enfrentamiento bélico entre hermanos Sudán, que ya ha cobrado la vida de seres humanos inocentes a más de 500 personas muertas y varios heridos, miles de desplazados, destruyendo infraestructuras, aumentando considerablemente la miseria y el hambre a la población civil. Nuestro país, Guinea Ecuatorial, siempre ha abogado como instrumento de soluciones de conflictos al diálogo y entendimiento para conseguir una verdadera paz y la estabilidad política. Pensamos que las Naciones Unidas debe jugar más su papel relevante para poner fin a las tomas del poder con la fuerza, dejando al margen la voluntad del pueblo, que es la democracia. Guinea Ecuatorial se solidariza con el pueblo hermano sudanés y a la vez que solicitamos poner fin a este conflicto bélico y mortal, a este conflicto donde la población civil se resulta cada vez más víctimas. Felicitamos la acción de las Naciones Unidas para lograr el fin.
Thank you. Excuse me, you've exhausted your time, and we will now continue with the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And the first speaker on my list is East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project. You have the floor. Again, East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project. You have the floor. Otherwise, we will skip you.
Sudanese activists and human rights defenders, including lawyers, and the youth resistance committees, which have been at the forefront of supporting civilians during the ongoing conflict. The events unfolding today in Sudan are a direct result of ongoing impunity for grave human rights abuses at the expense of the Sudanese people and their right to life and self-determination. We call for an immediate end to the fighting and for the international community to support Sudan through humanitarian aid, the establishment of an investigative mechanism, and for the continued support of the Sudanese civil society in transiting to a civilian-led democracy.
I do apologize to the Council, but I'm being informed that we need to sort out a technical problem, and we will start again with East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project. Please.
Mr. High Commissioner, once again, the Council is forced to address Sudan. The situation is dire. The absolute priority is ceasefire, delivery of aid, restoration of medical care, and humanitarian corridors. While the message holding this special session stands important, the draft resolution is not entirely satisfying. We reiterate the NGO call for an investigative mechanism. Until accessing the country is reasonably safe, experts will have to rely on remote monitoring and other rules. The criminal accountability standard used by judicial mechanisms is hard to reach, but political and moral accountability can deter violation and prevent reoccurrence, we hope. Mr. President, impunity allowed this to happen and systematic violation to continue. Without accountability, violence will recur. Up to 15th April, there was no real incentives on political actors to refrain from using violence and no prioritizing of accountability. African bodies and international community must do their utmost to help the democratic forces hold those responsible for inflicting this misery on the Sudanese people criminally accountable. I thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, this was the East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project, and we will continue now with a video intervention by International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute welcomes this special session. We remain gravely concerned over the conflicts in Sudan and the complete disregard of international humanitarian and human rights law by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. We condemn the indiscriminate killing of civilians and the targeting of hospitals, rendering 70% of them inoperable. We are gravely concerned by the exacerbation of existing human rights violations, especially the increased reports of sexual and gender-based violence and the breakdown of the rule of law across the country, with civilians having to fend for themselves with the collapse of existing infrastructure, institutions, and support mechanisms. There have been reports of uniformed soldiers displacing civilians from their homes and using civilian areas as shields against military attacks. We highlight the immense difficulty experienced by Sudanese nationals attempting to flee the conflict, including the exceptionally high prices to leave the country and the lack of coordinated evacuation efforts. We commend Sudanese activists and human rights defenders, including lawyers, and the youth resistance committees, which have been at the forefront of supporting civilians during the ongoing conflict. The events unfolding today in Sudan are a direct result of ongoing impunity for grave human rights abuses at the expense of the Sudanese people and their right to life and self-determination. We call for an immediate end to the fighting and for the international community to support Sudan through humanitarian aid, the establishment of an investigative mechanism, and for the continued support of the Sudanese civil society in transiting to a civilian-led democracy.
And the next video will be delivered by International Service for Human Rights.
Activists and volunteers leading the response to the grave humanitarian crisis despite the imminent threat to their safety and lives, including false accusation of treason, threats for both parties in the conflict, assassination lists, and smear campaigns against defenders, including women and children. Since the start of the war, hundreds were killed and thousands injured and missing, including women and children. At least 4 women medical workers were killed. The exchange of fire between the two parties in residential areas and in front of health facilities resulted in the killing of pregnant women on their way to give birth and preventing women from seeking health care and food for their children. Sexual assaults by men in uniform from both fighting parties were reported, including at least 7 cases of rape. Cyber security alerts are increasing due to the rise in the hate speech and harassment against women activists in social media. Most essential services are not working, including electricity, water, health care, with no sexual and reproductive health care and support for SGBV survivors, and communication, internet, and banking, hindering thousands of people from leaving Khartoum. Displacement of tens of thousands of women and children increases the humanitarian crisis at the borders. We urge for an end of the war, protection of civilians, including activists, open humanitarian corridors, protection of women from SGBV, establishment of an international investigation,
Now, in-person intervention from or by International Federation for Human Rights Leagues. You have the floor.
FIDH, ACJPS, and SHRM welcome the holding of this special session. The violence between the SAF and the RSF has resulted in the deaths of over 530 civilians, thousands injured or subjected to sexual violence, and close to 1 million displaced. Millions more are suffering in the resulting humanitarian crisis, with the targeting of civilian infrastructure creating dire food shortages and blocking access to even the most essential of services. Health facilities and medical personnel have been targeted in violation of international humanitarian law, while escalating intertribal tensions in West Darfur risk compounding the effects of the wider conflict. An immediate, sustainable ceasefire is an essential first step in resolving this conflict. Restrictions on freedom of movement and expression and on access to information have severely obstructed civic space. Human rights defenders have been targeted with death threats and violence, while women HRDs face particular risks of sexual and gender-based violence. We unequivocally condemn the targeting of civil society, who work in precarious conditions at great personal risk to carry out essential human rights and humanitarian work. The legacy of impunity in Sudan has gone hand in hand with continued instability and conflict. Lasting peace cannot be achieved without accountability for all perpetrators of human rights violations and justice for victims. We reiterate the call of over 100 civil society organizations to establish an independent investigative mechanism. As a well-established tool in the prevention of future human rights violations, accountability cannot be delayed. The time for statements has long passed. We call on states to fulfill their responsibilities as members of the Human Rights Council and take urgent, concrete action to protect the human rights of the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Human Rights Watch.
Mr. President, the last 4 weeks have shown all too starkly the brutal disregard of the parties to the conflict in Sudan for the lives of civilians. They've used heavy weapons in heavily populated urban areas and attacked and bombed critical infrastructure, including water systems and hospitals, that civilians who cannot flee need for their survival. Hundreds of civilians have been killed and wounded. Hundreds of thousands have fled their homes, often at great cost. Many remain stranded at Sudan's borders. Today, we are partly here due to the global failure to address decades of security force abuses in Sudan. Impunity for atrocities by both the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces underpins the current crisis. In the world's wishful thinking that Sudan was on the right path, accountability has repeatedly been sidelined. This crisis should have set off alarms that the international approach was not working and that decisive action is needed to address the impunity that has only emboldened Sudan's warring actors. In this context, we're dismayed by the collective failure to use this session to establish an independent mechanism to advance accountability, which over 100 Sudanese regional and international civil society organizations have called for, a failure that should be corrected when the Council reconvenes in a few weeks. In the meantime, we look forward to enhanced monitoring and public reporting by the Office and designated experts, and hope they will provide guidance on concrete steps that need to be taken to prevent further abuses, protect human rights, and advance accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, World Organization Against Torture.
Mr. President, the OMCT, the Giza Group, and the Human Rights Hub remain concerned by the ongoing conflict related to gross human rights violations in Sudan. More than 400 civilians have been killed, and thousands more are displaced without access to food, medical care, and other basic needs. Many other casualties remain unreported due to security situation and the destruction of many health facilities in Khartoum. The situation of human rights defenders is also worrisome. Journalists, doctors, human rights activists, and several aid workers are targeted by warring parties and risk their life and integrity while carrying out their duties during a conflict. Refugees and asylum seekers, particularly fleeing towards the Egyptian border and other Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia, are blocked at the borders and encouraged to return to Sudan via Port Sudan. If nothing is done, the conflict might escalate and turn into an ethnic conflict, as it is already the case in West Darfur and White Nile State. Mr. President, as we have constantly alerted, this situation is fueled by impunity, and it is urgent to establish a UN human rights monitoring and fact-finding mission that will help identify protection gaps and formulate specific recommendations for accountability and assistance program, including the protection of civilians, refugees, IDPs, and human rights defenders. This can only reinforce ongoing regional efforts, and only justice will bring peace in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will continue with a video statement by Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
يواصل القادة العسكريون تضييق فرص الانتقال في السودان بشكل ممنهج مع تحمل المدنيين والخطأ عليه. يجب على هذا المجلس أن يقف بحزم مع الشعب السوداني في الدعوة إلى وقف مضطرين وغير مسلمين والتأكيد على أن هجمات على المدنيين
for an immediate and unconditional release, emphasizing that attacks on civilians, including human rights defenders, medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and refugees, and targeting of hospitals and places of worship severely violate international human rights and international humanitarian law and amount to a war crime which will not go unpunished. On the 17th of April, the Anglican Cathedral in Khartoum was seized and used as a military base by RSF fighters who forced 42 people sheltering there, including the Archbishop and his family, to leave the building after being physically assaulted. In Bahri, the evangelical church was bombed and partially burned. We urge the Council to reiterate the inviolability of religious, cultural, and medical locations and any attempt to restore possibility without significant civilian involvement in the peace process will prove unsustainable. Additionally, a long-term commitment by this Council to supporting promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights will prove to be crucial in securing
and the next video will be delivered by Frontline, the International Foundation for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders.
Frontline Defenders works to protect human rights defenders at risk. Since the eruption of fighting on the 15th of April, human rights defenders in Sudan are at increased risk of assassination and have received death threats from all parties to the conflict. Extremists have publicly called for a fatwa to kill journalists and civil society leaders. Human rights defenders face increasingly dire circumstances with dwindling supplies and unreliable access to power, the internet, and banking services. This has limited their ability to carry out their crucial work, providing support to those in need, documenting human rights violations, and reporting back to partners. They are inherently at risk of targeted retaliations. Last week, human rights defenders Mohammed Ahmed and Mohammed Jamal were abducted and tortured by the Sudanese military while providing medical assistance. Their hands were cut and their heads shaved in an apparent attempt to humiliate them before they were released. We call on all parties to immediately cease hostilities and ensure human rights defenders can safely carry out their work, including by reinstating secure communication channels and banking services. We call on the Human Rights Council to establish an international investigative mechanism to ensure accountability for human rights violations.
Now, a in-person intervention by International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. We welcome the convening of this special session in response to the humanitarian emergency in the country. The numbers reported on the ground are unequivocal in confirming the humanitarian crisis affecting the population as a result of continued instability for years. The utmost urgency is to guarantee humanitarian access no matter what, in accordance with humanitarian obligations. Humanitarian actors must be granted the necessary safety to intervene. We know people in need of assistance reach more than 15 million, the third of Sudan's population, and that was before the current crisis began. We had too many worrying testimonies of an already fragile economy and precarious healthcare system. Now, health workers also have to deal with water shortage, power outage, and lack of basic medical supplies, with the constant fear of being caught in the crossfire, as some attacks have been directed at health facilities. The number of internally displaced people and refugees was high before the conflict. It dramatically increased in the past week. We therefore ask for urgent and prompt measures to be taken to assist the displaced and neighboring countries in this period. IFORD and Geneva International Center for Justice urge all concerned parties that civilians must be assured a safe evacuation from their home, and security must be guaranteed for the tens of thousands that have already left. We join the call for cessation of hostilities and respect for the principle of international law, especially the prohibition to target civilians. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will continue with Amnesty International.
Mr. President, we welcome the holding of this special session. At crucial moments since 2018, Sudanese people have staged waves of massive protests, oftentimes at great personal risk, to demand a system that better promotes and protects their rights. The Rapid Support Forces and the Sudan Armed Forces each have histories of committing serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law in the country, particularly in Darfur. These are forces that worked together since 2018 to crush protests and then to stage a coup against the country's transitional government in October 2021. These forces are violating international humanitarian law again, but now in their conflict with each other, as documented by us and detailed by many speakers today, causing massive suffering for civilians throughout the country. This must end. We call on all states to open safe pathways and ensure protection and support for people fleeing Sudan, and to provide prompt access to asylum and protection against refoulement. Ongoing violations in Sudan are part of a long history of impunity, and the Human Rights Council must act with ambition and in a manner complementary to other international, regional, and sub-regional efforts to help break this cycle of impunity. The Human Rights Council should establish an independent accountability mechanism along the lines called for by over 100 civil society organizations. This is what is needed and what should have happened today. We urge all delegations to support the resolution tabled as a step in the right direction and to support establishing such an independent accountability mechanism at the earliest possible opportunity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Association Maona for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you, President. We welcome the convening of this special session and express our utmost concern for the current human rights violations, such as the killing of civilians and the indiscriminate attacks on hospitals taking place in Sudan. While the situation has been escalating over the last 2 months, we reiterate that even before the violence began on April 15th, millions of people in Sudan and neighboring countries were already highly dependent on aid. More than a third of Sudan's population is already facing acute food insecurity, and the ongoing violence is only exacerbating this crisis, notably due to the restricted access granted to humanitarian workers. In addition to the crippling economic and security crisis, the people of Sudan are subject to gross human rights violations, such as arbitrary arrests and detention, unlawful attacks and killings, looting, obstruction of access to healthcare, and the forced occupation of civilian infrastructure. Geneva International Center for Justice and Mauna call on all parties to abide by their obligations under international human rights law and all relevant UN entities to take necessary measures to help those in need. We also note that what is happening in Sudan is only one example of the rise of militia and paramilitary groups in the region. Worrying situations in which powerful militias compete for and share power with the military have already been observed in other countries such as Yemen and Iraq. We reiterate our stance calling for the respect of the rule of law and the independence of national institutions. I thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with a video statement by Mart for Peace.
Thank you, Mr. President. Merit for Peace, Development and Human Rights would like to express its appreciation to the core group on this draft resolution. We are especially appreciative of the clause referencing to an enhancement of the interactive dialogue on the human rights situation in Sudan to include the participation of civil society and other stakeholders, as we believe that input from more stakeholders on the matter will lead to a multidimensional dialogue. Mr. President, we however believe that Operative Clause 6 requires more details in order to set out specific guidelines as to how the international community can provide protection to vulnerable populations in Sudan without risking the national security of the neighboring member states that may offer refuge. Merit also suggests adding a clause that calls for the urgent establishment of a hybrid court to prosecute individuals responsible for past atrocities, regardless of their affiliation or position, in order to deter current perpetrators from repeating these atrocities and securing guarantees of non-recurrence. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mizan Center for Human Rights, in person.
Thank you, President. The increasing reports of violence and human rights violations in the conflict in Sudan are extremely concerning, which is why this special session is imperative at such a critical moment in Sudan's history. We express our deepest concerns over the hostilities taking place in heavily populated areas, the unlawful means of warfare, and the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. This directly violates the international humanitarian law principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution enshrined in customary international law and the Geneva Conventions, both which must be respected by all parties to the conflict. We further strongly condemn the lack of access to humanitarian aid to civilians within Sudan. We implore all parties to open humanitarian corridors and allow humanitarian aid institutions to conduct their work and for them to do so in a safe and timely manner. The international community must also double its efforts to address the increasing humanitarian situation in Sudan, which will, according to the UNHCR, lead to a massive exodus. Therefore, we call on Sudan's neighboring countries to abide by their human rights obligations and keep their borders open, streamlining asylum procedures and ensuring respect for the principle of non-refoulement. Finally, Mission Center for Human Rights and Geneva International Center for Justice strongly condemn the ongoing hostilities and urge the parties to return to the negotiation table, striving to de-escalate the conflict and achieve a common and durable solution for peace in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. And we continue with Rencontre africaine pour la défense des droits de l'homme.
Señor presidente, la Rada acoge con satisfacción la organización de esta sesión especial, que es la tercera sobre Sudán desde la creación del Consejo. Después de 4 semanas de violencia extrema y de violaciones masivas y graves de los derechos humanos en Sudán, los cadáveres siguen ensuciando las calles de Jartum, por no mencionar el elevado número de heridos, la afluencia masiva de desplazados internos y de refugiados en los países vecinos. La Rada condena enérgicamente los continuos bombardeos aéreos sobre la población civil, la destrucción de viviendas y hospitales, y el saqueo del Programa Mundial de Alimentos y otras organizaciones humanitarias. Tras el genocidio de Darfur y la caída de Omar al-Bashir, todas las esperanzas del valeroso pueblo sudanés de democracia, libertad, justicia y lucha contra la impunidad están condenadas al fracaso. Rado responsabiliza a los 2 grandes generales de los crímenes, asesinatos, ejecuciones sumarias y extrajudiciales perpetrados en el país desde el comienzo de la crisis. Es hora de que la comunidad internacional se movilice para acompañar el proceso de diálogo político y una inminente intervención militar para proteger a la población indefensa. Además, la RADO sigue preocupada por los llamamientos a la incitación del odio racial, así como por la manifestación de racismo entre diferentes grupos étnicos y tribales. En conclusión, la RADO hace un llamamiento a ambas partes para que observen un alto al fuego inmediato y abran el corredor humanitario para el acceso a la asistencia sanitaria y a las necesidades básicas. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Public health assistance and for meeting basic needs. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Broad National Movement.
السيد الرئيس، السادة الأعضاء، كل الشكر لإقامة هذه الجلسة الخاصة ونيابة عن الزملاء في الجبهة الوطنية العريضة. في البدء نترحم على أرواح شهداء الحرب وندعو إلى وقف الحرب الدائرة والتي تمثل جريمة حرب وفق المادة 8 من ميثاق روما المنشئ لمحكمة الجنايات الدولية، والتي تأخذ فيها المدنيين كدروع بشرية مما خلق كارثة حقيقية داخل البلاد. ومن واقع مسؤوليتكم الإنسانية والمنصوص عليها في كثير من المعاهدات التي تحمي المدنيين العزل في وقت وقف من مسؤوليتكم الإنسانية والمنصوص عليها. نرجو وقف الحرب والعمل على تقديم العون والصحي لجميع المتضررين وتسهيل الممرات الإنسانية لإجلاء المدنيين وتوصيل المساعدات واتخاذ والغذاء وتوفير العلاج وحماية المستشفيات ودور العبادة. كما نطالب المجتمع الدولي بتصنيف القيادات الإسلامية داخل الجيش وكتائبهم الجهادية من كتائب ظل وأمن شعبي وطلابي وكتائب ميليشيات الدعم السريع، تنظيمات إرهابية تهدد السلم والأمن الدولي. شكرا.
Thank you. And now let me invite Interfaith International.
Monsieur le Président, l'éclatement d'un nouveau cycle de violence spirale au Soudan est la conséquence directe de l'échec de la transition ainsi que l'impunité chronique dont jouissent les principaux responsables du génocide au Darfour il y a 20 ans. Interfaith International condamne sans réserve la poursuite des exactions contre les populations civiles sans défense, la destruction des infrastructures hospitalières, les bombardements des civils et zones d'habitation, pillage des dépôts humanitaires et attaques ciblées des médecins, du personnel des agences de l'ONU, des journalistes et défenseurs des droits humains constituent un crime contre l'humanité. l'humanité. Interface International demande aux deux parties en conflit de créer des conditions pour l'ouverture d'un couloir humanitaire et la protection des infrastructures hospitalières pour sauver des vies humaines. Interface International soutient la mise sur pied d'une commission internationale d'enquête ainsi que la nomination d'un panel d'experts pour accompagner le pays afin de prévenir un nettoyage ethnique. En conclusion, Interface International soutient pleinement la lutte du peuple soudanais pour la démocratie et il réaffirme son attachement à la sécurité, à la souveraineté, à l'unité, l'indépendance et à l'intégrité territoriale du Soudan. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Thank you. And the Institute for Human Rights is the next.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Institute for Human Rights is very concerned about Sudan's humanitarian situation in the wake of the conflict that started in mid-April of this year. Already, the situation with refugees and internally displaced people is critical. According to the UN data, the conflict had caused approximately 700,000 people to become internally displaced, and the incoming reports show that these figures are dramatically increasing with each passing day. There is a serious risk to food security in the country as supply chains are being disrupted. Just recently, a fire destroyed the crop market in Yala, the capital city of South Darfur, which can result in a potential shortage of food in the region. The healthcare system is of particular concern. The Sudanese Doctors Trade Union has reported that 60 out of 88 hospitals in or near clash zones remain closed, with 28 being threatened with closure due to a lack of staff and essential supplies. Doctors and medical workers have been threatened and face repressions, physical violence, illegal surveillance and tracking. Institute for Human Rights believes that international community and Human Rights Council in particular should use all the available mechanisms to facilitate a quick end to hostilities and provide rapid humanitarian assistance to the affected population. Only thus a greater humanitarian catastrophe can be averted. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me give the floor to the Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety.
Thank you, Mr. President. RFS is concerned about a considerable deterioration of the human rights situation in Sudan since 15 April 2023. An armed conflict between SAF and RSF indiscriminately targets civilian population and infrastructure, resulting in the 600 people dead and thousands more injured. While recognizing the human casualties as a key issue to be promptly solved, the RFS would like to highlight that the conflict has placed many journalists and media workers within the country in a difficult position, further exacerbating their challenges of their job. After the military coup in 2021, Sudanese authorities already introduced several restrictions of freedom of expressions by imposing internet blackout, banning media outlets and press institutions, detaining, beating and intimidating a number of Sudanese journalists. The situation with the access to information and journalist safety was worsened since the escalation of the conflict, as the radio and television headquarters were one of the key targets of the two parties. Local and international media representatives report in constant threat of their lives while performing their duties, both from the crossfire and the suspension tools from their armed groups. The RFS called to UN member states to undertake all possible international regulative mechanisms to ensure lasting peace and safety for the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker on my list is African Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The African Center associates itself with the remarks and concerns expressed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights before this special session. No one knows the exact numbers of victims, civilians and military alike, but all evidence suggests that thousands of individuals lost their lives or injured mainly due to indiscriminate aerial bombardment and heavy artillery, and we call for immediate end of these crimes. The ongoing military confrontations scrap the hopes and aspirations of the Sudanese people for better life, peaceful transition to civilian governance and enjoyment of liberties. This unfortunate development harbinger that peace in Sudan is an unattainable dream and that millions of war victims in Darfur and elsewhere in the country will continue to suffer for years to come. As a reminder, Mr. President, Sudan has been under the public procedure of the UN human rights for over 30 years, yet we see no change in government practices. The painful reality behind this sad story, which is yet to be addressed, is that while Sudan is an African country and officially colorblind, however, racism, discrimination, and manipulation of ethnic and tribal differences are at the heart of the country's protracted violence and political instability. It is time for Sudan to address the root causes of armed conflicts. And it is also time for the African Union and the international community at large to continue to treat the symptoms and leave the disease uncured. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as I've indicated, we have exhausted the list of speakers. So let me thank you for your contributions, for your active participation. Let me thank to the interpreters for allowing us actually to finish the whole list of speakers this morning. This is the end of this morning session. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. to take an action on the draft resolution A/HRC/S36/L1. And now let me declare close the first meeting of this 36th special session of the Human Rights Council, and let me wish you good afternoon and see you at 3 p.m. sharp. Thank you.
Sail across the ocean just to be with you, to hold you close, meet you down by the river where we used to be, where time stands still. So we're gonna close our eyes and see the story of our lives. Dancing by the river all night long. So we're dancing by the river all night long. So we stay young. Dancing by the river all night long. So we're dancing by the river all night long. So we stay young, go on and on, go on and on. Dancing by the river all night long. So we're dancing by the river all night long. So we stay young. Dancing by the river all night long. So we're dancing by the river all night long. So we stay young, go on and on.
Radio Swiss Pop.